I think that we need to be equipped to the point that we are at least what Peter said. He said, be ready to give an answer. Not get ready, but be ready. All right. Hold on just a second. There we go. So sorry about that. My camera wasn't working, but it is your friendly favorite neighborhood apologist, Damon Richardson, with another edition of UrbanLogia Live. And thank you for being here tonight. This is going to be a very difficult conversation to have, but I appreciate everyone who has taken the time to listen. This is going to be a very important conversation. We all know why we are here, so we won't spend a lot of time talking about the event of Charlie Kirk's murder. We won't get into a lot of the peripherals. Blessings to all of you. I see you. We're going to try to conserve a little bit of the time. We'll avoid some of the shout outs because we want to get right into the topic tonight. But I see you. I thank you all. And if you are new to this channel, if you would do me a favor, hit the subscribe button. We'd love for you to be a subscriber so that you could listen out for more of the content from this channel as we talk about all things related to theology, church history, apologetics, as well as biblical studies. And very often, and sometimes I would say, we do critique social issues in light of scripture, such as what we are going to be doing today. And so without any further ado, I want to get right into the topic, and that is Charlie Kirk on trial. Is he a racist or a Christian? And so I want to examine the evidence. There is, as it is in our country and as it has been, a lot of polarization around Charlie, around what we should be thinking about him, particularly as the church and particularly as Christians. And yesterday, today is Monday, yesterday proved exactly what many of us have been saying. And let me start off by saying this. If you're new to this channel, don't be taken aback by my passion. What I will attempt to do is to restrain as much of my passion so that I can make clearer, more cogent and concise arguments, although with passion. But I want you to hear what I am saying, and I will be unapologetically making some statements, some claims that I will back up. And one of those claims is that white Christianity in America has acted significantly hypocritically. I will say that again. I think that many white Christian leaders ought to be ashamed of themselves, that they ought to repent, that they have been hypocritical. They have been agents of racism and complicit in the racial divide in this country. And that's not just historically true, but it was proven on yesterday. You just go back 10, 15 years and you look at the hotbed of turmoil that this country was embroiled in over police brutality and many injustices that caused Black people in this country to cry out, particularly even Black Christians, went back to their churches and wondered what many of their pastors would say about it. How would you pastor? What do you say to African Americans who are members of your congregation? And I'll tell you what, and I'll say this unapologetically again. Most white pastors said zero. In fact, they told us that, hey, we just focus on preaching the gospel. We don't get involved in politics and current events, so forth and so on. And contrast that now with their very public outcry. So I saw more white pastors get very vocal and loud as it relates to Charlie Kirk's death, louder than they have ever been about any single issue that concerns Black people. What do we conclude about that? Well, their silence is another way of saying we don't care about issues that are particular to Black concern, and their particular and notable vocalization as it relates to Charlie Kirk tells us where their concerns are. When they get loud, it is when white life is unjustly taken. When they get silent, it is where Black life is unjustly taken. Now, say what you want, but prove me wrong, because white pastors have been very conspicuously silent as it relates to Black issues, and they are not now. They're all talking, and I don't want to get to naming it because it would be just far too many. Many of the periodicals, they're writing articles about it. They're all getting loud now. Suddenly, they have found their voice. Say what you want, but that's hypocritical. It's hypocritical, and it just further proves that whites are that white Christianity is inherently racist. And I am going to make the argument tonight that what we are talking about when we refer to white Christianity and Christianity from in its most biblical sense, that we are not talking about the same things. And so give me 1 second. Let me find this quote. I want to, should have put it up on the screen, but I will read it nonetheless. And just a second. Give me 1 second. Let me pull this up. Okay. Hold on just a second. I'm going to pull this up and I want to read it. I want you to, because this is what I'm going to be working from. So this is the framework that I will be working from in this conversation. So let me just find my my quote here. Just a second. And okay, there's one. Let me pull up my other one. Just a second. All right, here we go. All right, so here is my framework. This is what I want to, okay, here we go. Where's it at? Where's it at? Where's it at? That's not it. Just a second. Okay, thought I had it. Give me just 1 second to pull this second quote up because it's important to this conversation. Okay. All right. All right. Here we go. All right, let me read this. All right, so this is what I want to say about biblical Christianity versus what I would refer to as white evangelicalism. So let me read this. This is from the appendix of Frederick Douglass. I had it up here on screen and can't find it, so I had to pull it from my phone. So I want you to listen to what Frederick Douglass says here. And then I'm going to pull a quote from Marcus Garvey as it relates to the Nicene Creed. So here's Frederick Douglass's quote. I want you to hear this. He says, "What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. So I want you to notice the distinction he makes. He talks about the Christianity of this land, which he calls a slaveholding religion, and then he says with no possible reference to Christianity proper. So he means to draw distinction, to create a binary between two different things that are utilizing the name Christianity. One is Christianity biblical or proper, and the other one is the Christianity of this land. He says, for between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, there are your two categories. He says, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. So just to kind of recap so far, the Christianity of this land, he calls it bad, corrupt, and wicked. And the Christianity of Christ, he says it is good, pure, and holy. Then Douglas goes further and says to be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. He says, now I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, women whipping, cradle plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. So you'll notice that Douglas very poignantly and, even prophetically, I would add, is able to discern and to distinguish that the Christianity of this land is not biblical Christianity. And he's arguing that because it does not act in alignment with the person and work of Christ. In fact, he says that it is corrupt. It's slave holding. That's not something that Christ would ever approve of. It's women whipping, it's cradle plundering, it's partial, and it's hypocritical. He says, indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. So then he goes to say, while it may co-opt the name Christianity, he says, I don't find any good reason for it to consider itself Christianity at all. He's arguing that is deceitful, that it is duplicitous for the Christianity of this land based on the way that it has acted towards other image bearers, that it can hardly consider itself to be Christian. He says, I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers. He gets very wordy here, but listen, the climax of all misnomers. You know what a misnomer is, right? So it is a way of coming to the wrong idea or the wrong conclusion based on some way of thinking, right? So he's saying if you thought that the religion of this land was Christian, that is a misnomer. You are incorrect. He says it's the boldest of all frauds. So of all the frauds that Douglas could think of and all the fraudulent things going on at that time, he said the Christianity of this land was the boldest of all frauds and the grossest of all libels. Never, listen, was there a clearer case of stealing the livery of the court of heaven to serve the devil in. That is what Douglas thought about the Christianity of this land. Now, when it comes down to Marcus Mosiah Garvey, this is what he had to say about the very same thing. Let me just pull that up just a second. I want you to hear the way that they articulate their understanding of the difference between the two things. So here's what Garvey had to say about it. Hold on. Come on, Garvey. All right. Where's Garvey's statement? Okay, just a second. I hate when this kind of stuff happens. I am not the most technologically savvy, but I will find it here in a second. I want to read it rather than try to quote it because I think it is that important. And I posted it. I literally posted about it here just recently. I may have to move on, but I'll say this. What Garvey says, let me just paraphrase. So what Garvey says is that he would never hold biblical Christianity at fault. He says that he loved the Nicene faith. So I'll put it that way. And he articulated the Nicene faith as in the belief in the triunity of God. And he said, I will never hold Christ responsible for what evil men have done in his name. And he talks about slaveholding and land stealing and all of these different things. He says, now, I love Christ. I love Christianity. I hold to a Nicene faith. But the essentially the Christianity of this land is not Christianity. And he essentially castigates it in the very same way that Douglas does. Now, having said all of that, I wanted to set that up, and excuse me for not having, I should have had that up on the screen. I've got a number of things on multiple screens, and can't find where it is to put it up on the screen so that you can see it. Nevertheless, I wanted to use that as a framework for this conversation, because what I want to prove in this Charlie Kirk on trial is that Charlie Kirk is a Christian only in the sense of the Christianity of this land that Douglas and Garvey rightly assessed was not biblical Christianity. Now, you can try to make all the arguments that you want, but the Bible says, this is Jesus's words, and you will know them by the fruit that they bear. And so one of the problems with the way that Christianity is often discussed in this context, especially in relationship to the Christianity of this land, is whether or not one is biblically orthodox. That is, whether or not they're holding to the essentials of the Christian faith. And while I would argue that those propositional essentials of the Christian faith are distinct and essential to what it means to be a Christian from a theological, a doctrinal, and a gospel standpoint, I would go further to argue that if within the scope of the gospel, you don't exhibit gospel orthopraxy, that is the right practice, the right way of living out the gospel, and orthopathy, that is the right attitude, the right affection, the right sense of seeing others. If none of those things align with the New Testament, I would say that having 1/3 of what would be considered Christian faith falls short of what Christian faith actually is. In fact, in the book of Galatians, chapter 2, Paul argues that Peter, he says, has not been walking in line or in step with the gospel. The Greek word that he uses there is orthopraxy. In other words, your steps do not rightly align with what the gospel actually means. He never accused Peter of actually, from a theological standpoint, saying something contrary to the gospel. He said that Peter did not walk according to the gospel. And so, in other words, Peter's orthopraxy did not align with his orthodoxy. Now, in the Christianity of this land, i.e. white evangelicalism, you could get away with the first one. I mean, you could hold to the first one, that is orthodoxy, and never really walk out your faith faithfully, the Christian faith faithfully, which allows them to be able to, which we have seen historically and in the past, to be able to justify slaveholding, to be able to justify black codes to be able to justify Jim Crow laws, the dehumanization, the brutalization, the mistreatment, the murder of black people, all in the name of Christianity, right? And because their view of the gospel is essentially truncated to essentially to basically comprise justification. They're able then to just justify that, well, as long as I'm justified by faith, even when these other things, and this is why many of their favorite theologians, even from the 18th century, 19th century, have been slave-holding theologians. Some of their favorite preachers, Whitfield, Jonathan Edwards, slave holders, and they're able to still justify because as far as they're concerned, well, they checked all of the right boxes theologically. Never mind those things, right? And so when your faith allows you to do that, you can then justify a praxis that doesn't align with the gospel and still get away with calling yourself a Christian. Now, that is significantly problematic for all kinds of reasons that I am going to get into in this conversation tonight. So I got a long way to go. I probably got about 26, 27 points that I got to get to, but I'm going to get to these points, and I am going to try and move as succinctly and as cogently as possible. So one of the first things that I want to address is this. It is this notion of it is the idea of political violence, right? And so we have seen, I mean, this country has been filled not just with political violence, but with social violence historically, right? And much of that violence, Black people and indigenous people have been on the receiving end of it, right? That's a historical fact. That's not woke, that's just facts, right? So here's the thing, though. One of the things that I am concerned with in this conversation is the way violence is actually being treated in this conversation. So what people are doing is they're saying, oh, well, you know, hey, listen, you can disagree with somebody's ideology, but, you know, nobody has the right to take another person's life simply because they disagreed with them, right? And you know, just because they disagreed with their ideas, you know, this whole notion, I'm afraid that we're going to be moving towards more violence in this country. Well, on one part of that, I would agree. I would certainly hate for somebody to shoot a sniper's bullet through this window while I am doing this live because they disagreed with me. But I want us to be clear about that whole notion, right? So there is a difference between someone who has a harmful ideology. Now, this is no justification for killing, so don't take anything I'm saying out of context. But there is a difference between having a harmful ideology that is inherently racist and dangerous, and then merely disagreeing with somebody's ideology. And here's one of the reasons why. Harmful ideologies that are inherently and innately racist are violent. And part of the problem is that many of the people having these conversations do not have an expanded understanding of what violence is. So they reduce violence essentially to just physical violence. In Genesis 6, what's interesting is that just before Yahweh, hold on just a second. Just before, let me, hold on, my screen, hold on just a second here. There we go. All right, so yeah, so just before Yahweh, we get the narrative about why he is going to destroy the earth, and we're hearing about essentially the Nephilim and a number of these different things, right? And so one of the things that we hear Yahweh say is that the antediluvian world, that is the people who were living prior to the flood, he says that all of their thoughts and the imaginations of their heart were continuously evil. Here's the interesting thing about that. The Hebrew word there for evil is the word violent. What the text doesn't say is that people were more physically violent in that time than they are now. I would argue that there's probably a significantly more physical violence in the world that we live in today than it was then. I doubt that anybody tagging the ark, spraying a graffiti tag or defacing it or taking the leak on the side of the ark, I doubt that that's what God had in mind. Now, if Noah were building that ark in our day and time, it would probably take a little longer than Shem's 100 years from the time he was born to the time they entered the ark. I'd argue that while Noah's building on one side, folk will be on the other side, stealing that wood and selling it off, right? It is significantly worse in our day than it was in Noah's day. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that what Yahweh was looking at was a different kind of violence. He was looking at a mental violence, an intellectual and ideological violence that lived not only in people's hearts, but in their minds. And he says that they were evil continuously. And so my point in bringing that out is to say that one of the reasons that Charlie Kirk was a dangerous ideologue is because his ideas perpetuated intellectual violence against Black people. His ideas about Black people are dangerous, and these ideas are violent. And when I say violence, I don't simply mean in the physical sense. I mean in the sense of things that cause others harm. It is those kinds of thoughts, those kinds of embedded ideas that live in people's heart, i.e. white supremacy and racism, that give birth to the physical violence, right? Now, here's another thing that I want to point out that I think is wrong with this conversation. You constantly have people talking about, because, I knew this would happen. Once the narratives got out, the arguments got out about the various things that that Charlie Kirk had said that were racist, I already knew that the machine was going to start turning out numerous videos of Black people saying, oh no, Charlie wasn't a racist. Look, here's the reason why. And some of them are saying, well, I'm a friend with Charlie. One guy went so far as to say Charlie wasn't no racist. I call him, white chocolate. That's my nickname for. And then, you see Charlie in the background smiling and Candace Owens right next to them. And then he goes on to say Charlie was, he was bringing, Black kids to the White House, as if black kids go to the White House on field trips all the time, right? So we don't need Charlie Kirk. We never needed Charlie Kirk for that. Second of all, a whole Black family lived in the White House, right? You do know that, right? Third of all, Black people built the White House. So I don't get how Charlie bringing Black kids to the White House somehow doesn't make him racist. The other thing is this is the typical response and rebuttal. Oh, they're using sound bites and clips of videos, and these things are taken out of context. Let me say something about that so that you can understand. I want you to hear it from an intelligent man. Listen to what I'm saying. Let me explain something about context, right? So first of all, it is possible to use edited clips, be they short clips or whatever, to take a person's words out of context. Let me explain what I mean by that, right? So if I were to say, let me just grab a name from off the the chat here. Jonathan Long's my good friend Long up in Ohio. So if I said Jonathan, there are people who say that African Americans are lazy, are shiftless, are immoral, and that they are a cancer to this society. I disagree with them. Taking words out of context, here's what that would look like. It would look like somebody putting that video up and deliberately omitting the part where I say to Jonathan, there are people who think. By doing that, that changes the entire trajectory of what has been said. In fact, now it looks like I am saying that. And it even looks like I'm saying that I further disagree with Black people, right? So that is an example of what it would look like to change somebody's words, whether it's long form or short form. But let's be clear and let's also be honest. Short form content is used to provide a summation of the longer form. In fact, Charlie Kirk's own YouTube channel is full of these clips. Most of these clips came from Charlie's own YouTube page. Why? Nobody makes short form content and then turns around and think that, yeah, this is a misrepresentation of what I meant. They're creating the short form content because it does represent the whole, and they're trying to draw you into looking at the video in its entirety. In any case, if a person never looks at the video in its entirety, they have heard rightly and in context what the person said and what they meant. Many of the times we read resource books that are significant resources, whether they are lexicons or commentaries. Nobody reads these books in their entirety. We take the parts out that are most necessary and the most helpful, and we deal with that right now. So nobody needs to listen to anybody's entire sermon. Let's just get this straight. Yeah, I don't know who taught you or where you learned from. Nobody needs to listen to the entirety of anybody's anything to rightly understand what they meant in a particular statement, right? Whether it's a written statement or whether it is a spoken statement. Unless, again, it is taken out of context so as to suggest that that's not what the person meant or that's not what they actually said, right? And so what they are saying, many of these Charlie Kirk apologists are attempting to say that these short videos were taken out of context, when in fact they are actually his words. I find it interesting that they are less appalled at what he's saying and more concerned with, but you got to listen to all of his debates. You got to listen to, well, if this statement doesn't represent what he actually said and what he believed, then what in fact does it represent? And so this leads me to my other point about that. There is a thing called subtext that many of his followers are obviously completely oblivious to. Subtext is what's not said, but what is inferred. And we find subtext often in literature as well as in spoken pieces, right? And so it's not just what he said, it is the underlying inferences and the underlying ideas and beliefs behind his statement that are not overtly said. This is one of the great apologetic arguments. There are people I deal with all the time. Jesus never came right out and said, I am God. And to that would be true. But in what he did say, and even things that he inferred, he was in fact making claims that he was God, even if he did not say it in that exact word order, right? So people who are arguing that Charlie Kirk can't be a racist, because he never really said this or that. Like I saw J.D. Vance arguing, Charlie Kirk didn't say all Black women didn't possess the brain processing power. He just said it was Michelle Obama and Ketanji Brown, Justice Ketanji Brown, and so forth and so on. He just said that. But if anybody really looks at that video objectively, he doesn't have to actually come out and say that that's all Black women. What he inferred, here's how I know. Well, if you would take, let's just say this. Let's take, who was it? Was it W.E.B. Du Bois's Talented 10, right? And let's just say that those that he named represented essentially the Talented 10, right? Now, they've got a significant amount of education. Most of them have at least 3, some of them 4 degrees. They are incredibly qualified. In fact, African-American women hold more degrees than any other demographic in this country. So suffice it to say that from an academic standpoint, African-American women are more educated than any other group in this country. So if you take these women that he named and say that they lack brain processing power and that they needed DEI in order to steal jobs that belong to white people, well, I don't know how anybody could not draw the inference from that would mean the same thing for other Black women who don't have the stellar careers that they had, don't have the level of education that they have. But if these women don't have brain processing power, I mean, I just don't know which Black women would if they don't, right? So you don't have to make that statement. But these are the kinds of cheap arguments that are being made to justify Charlie Kirk's racism. Now, let me say this again. I know that there's a hot debate going on in the comment section. I wish some of you would keep your eyes here and listen to what I am saying, right? Nobody's interested in you making your counter arguments, right? Hopefully you came to listen, right? So listen to what I'm saying. This other notion about, I saw many Black people with these kinds of posts, and it just burned me. Like literally it burned me, right? So for some reason we feel that we've got to go out of our way. And I know that I'm right about it. Black people feel that they've got to go out of their way to demonstrate their empathy. Nobody's saying that showing empathy is, and nobody's arguing against whether that is a Christian virtue or not. We're not even arguing against that. Empathy is in fact a Christian virtue. I laud that virtue, in fact. But we see it all the time. Black people will go out of their way to offer forgiveness, to show empathy, to show that we're essentially safe. So they were making these arguments about, oh well, what happened to Charlie was, it was horrible. It was, all these different adjectives about it. I don't disagree. Killing somebody like that, it's horrible. I don't disagree with that. But they were going out of their way, carrying on with how bad it was. And then, going to say, now my greatest issue is with people celebrating it. Now, let's just be honest here. There probably was a couple of people, some sprinkle of folk who probably was like, I'm glad Charlie's dead. But these were most likely not Christian people. So it's a complete misrepresentation and an exaggeration to suggest, to be trying to chin check Black Christians for celebrating Charlie's death, right? it was completely uncalled for. The other thing that I noticed was conspicuously missing from this chin checking were the millions of white people in comment sections on every post about Charlie, threatening civil war, violence. Nobody was chin checking them. Nobody was checking for that response. The only response that anybody ever seemed to be concerned with was the so-called Black response, which from what I saw and what most people that I talked to saw was overwhelmingly empathetic. What I argue is that nobody was really seeing some disproportionate number of celebrations. What they were doing was conflating critique for celebration. That's what they were doing. And it even went as far as this. Well, now, while I had my differences and my ideological differences with Charlie, one thing that I respected about Charlie Kirk was that he stood on what he believed. He stood 10 toes down on what he believed. Now, let me say something about that. Since when does standing 10 toes down on being wrong about about things like racism, systemic racism, and injustices, since when is it noble to stand 10 toes down on something that you are that wrong about? You don't get credit for being wrong or being on the wrong side of such an important issue. You don't get credit for that. I mean, let's just be clear. Adolf Hitler stood 10 toes down as in commitment to what he believed about the superiority of German people. He was so committed to it that he killed himself. He wasn't even willing to allow the Americans to take his own life. Now that's commitment, right? So since when is that noble? No. What's noble is for people to stand 10 toes down on right causes and the right view of things. And even then, essentially, some of them end up paying with their lives on it, right? So a better example of that would have been Dr. Martin Luther King. He stood 10 toes down on what he believed, but what he believed was the right thing. He believed the right thing about humanity. He had the right assessment about racism in this country. And yet, a sniper's bullet took his life as well. Now, no, you don't get credit for that. Excuse me. Let me move further. I got a couple other things to say before we start getting into the meat of this thing. I also want to address that just because a person says something that is true doesn't make them a truth teller. Now, let me put that on pause because I'm going to come back and get that statement. Let me make this statement first. Now, I think it is necessary to concede this fact that many people who were probably sincerely bothered that Charlie Kirk was assassinated and was like, oh, people who expressed that. Many of these people weren't aware of Charlie's racist views. Now, I'm going to tell you how I know. Well, the algorithm shows some people, some things that it doesn't show others. So there were many people who thought Charlie Kirk is just he's a good Christian. He's an apologist even. And he was always standing for the truth. As far as the algorithm has shown them, they have seen videos where Charlie Kirk was saying some true things. I'm not even going to debate that. He did say some things that were true. I mean, but there are a lot of people that I disagree with who say things that are true, right? So the fact of that he said some true things doesn't make him a truth teller, right? So many of these people were deceived, I would say, by the algorithm. They only saw those kind of videos that essentially showed him in the most positive ways. And of course, if you flood if you flood social media with a lot of videos, the algorithm will push those to the top. So it is very possible that many people only saw those and were confused about what do people mean that he's a racist. They hadn't seen those. In fact, there were family members of mine that were shocked when they saw some of the other videos. They had no idea that these were his positions. So I would say to many of you that you found it a shock that many of us were calling him a racist. No fault of your own. The algorithm tricked you. The algorithm deceives you. The algorithm showed you only one part of the picture, but not the whole thing. I am more concerned with what people do with all of the information now once they have it. And what I've seen many people do is turn into spin masters for Charlie Kirk. Try to find ways to justify the things that he said because they simply believe in him, because they want what he says to be true. Now, in Acts chapter 16, there is Paul in Philippi, and there is a woman with a demon of a spirit of divination, and she follows them for a number of days. And I want you to notice that what she's saying is the truth. She said that these are men of God. Now, amen to that, because she was right. She was telling the truth. But what Paul discerned was that the devil or the demons in the woman was attempting to operate in duplicity by affirming that these men were men of truth. She was able to subtly align herself with them, because let's just put it out there like this. I mean, if the lady with the spirit of divination is caping for Paul and Barnabas, then perhaps they are not orbiting theologically as far apart as many would have thought. Perhaps they're even on the same team. So the devil's strategy was to discredit Paul and Barnabas by association with a woman who practiced fortune telling. Paul understood that the bigger picture is not the truth that she's telling, it's what lies under that, right? So this is where I want to come for many of you Kirk apologists and believers, so convinced that he was the Christian that you think he was, and that he's not a racist, is that he said some things that were true. We are more concerned, however, with the other things that he said that are dangerous. You see, when somebody wants to deceive a person, they don't deceive them specifically with blatant outright lies. They typically tell more truth, because the truth hides the presence of the lie, right? They're able to conceal it a little bit better. It's like rat poison that is, 90% corn and yet 10% strychnine. I mean, if all of it was poison, we'd be able to know that, oh yeah, this is all false, right? So the concern is not whether or not he ever spoke any kind of truth. I'm sure he did say some things that were true that I would agree with, and most of you would agree with, if we're being honest. But our concern is with the falsehoods that he told and what's behind that. And I am going to get into those here in just a couple of minutes. I'm working my way down because I want to make some points in terms of framing this conversation. The other thing that I want to point out is that here's what we're not going to do. We are not going to frame this conversation as liberal and conservative. in some political sense. Oh, and because, you know, here's what they will say. And here's what they're probably already saying in the comment section. They're listening and they're saying, I wonder what kind of liberal leftist Damon is. Well, let me disappoint you real quick. Or as we say sometimes in the hood, right quick. Let me disappoint you right quick. I am not a liberal leftist at all, right? I do not subscribe to leftist ideology or politics, right? So this doesn't come down to liberal, the difference between conservatives and liberals. That's how the majority of white folks are framing it. They've been super energetic about. They didn't even know the identity of the shooter, but already we know that he came from the left. The left, and this is on the Democrats. This is Obama's fault. That's how they argue, right? These false binaries that they create. Let me evoke Malcolm. Malcolm warned us a long time ago that liberals were just as racist as conservatives are. So we are under no illusion of thought that this conversation comes down to conservatives and liberals. We are talking about racists, and they come in the conservative and the liberal brand, right? So this is not about the left or the right. I know you want to make it that way. That's because your mind is stuck in simplistic kind of arguments, reductionist arguments. You're not going to be able to pull that one here. We are talking about racism right now. So let's have that conversation, because this isn't about liberal and conservative conversations. Now, I want to address, here's some of the things that I want to address. We'll do some video. Some of it I don't have video for. Many of you have already seen pretty much most of them. So when I reference them, you'll know what I'm talking about. We're going to be talking about his position on reparations, Kirk's position on DEI, his position on civil rights, the Civil Rights Act, his position on Juneteenth, his denial of systemic racism, his statements about Black people being better off in the 1950s than they are now, and all of these kinds of statements that he made, even the one about Black pilots. I intend to get to all of those things. Now, hang in there with me. Hang in there with me. I gotta, there's a lot to unpack, right? And I know folk are used to 1 minute sound bites and all of these different kind of things, right? But Charlie Kirk has an entire library of misinformation. So pardon me if I can't get to all of his misinformation in a 60-second Instagram or TikTok kind of video. If that's what you're looking for, you've come to the wrong place, right? It takes a little time to unwind the layers of misinformation, right? So hang in there with me. The other thing that I want to deal with, I've talked about essentially white silence and lack of empathy. It's if it weren't sad, it would be comical how they are calling now for empathy when they lacked the most of it in very critical times in this country. Suddenly, we ought to be all concerned about, and it's a sad thing when somebody's life is unjustly taken. So, I won't speak in negative ways about that, right? But where I mean, let's just be honest. Where was the empathy? Where was this empathy for George Floyd's family? Where was this empathy for what's his name? Tamir Rice. Where was that empathy for his family when they were calling for justice? Where was that empathy? Where was the empathy for King's family? Right? Where was it? Where was this empathy for? I can go on and on and on, but where was that? Right? I tell you where it wasn't. It was in none of the statements of white evangelical churches. It was not on the lips of white Christians. The empathy was coming from Black people and from foreign nations even. They show greater empathy, right? Suddenly they're calling for empathy. I think that's convenient and it's hypocritical. And you can disagree with me all you want, but facts are facts, and you don't get to position opinions in the face of facts, right? Black people lacked empathy. I mean, white people lacked historical empathy when it came down to things that concerned Black people in terms of injustices and many of these things. That's just a fact. So a couple other things I want to point out. I definitely want to talk about, obviously, we've talked about selective outrage. I want to talk about Christian nationalism here because I think it is important for us to understand Christian nationalism. Now, when we think in light again of Douglas's and Garvey's statement as a framework for explaining that how many are confusing, sorry about that, biblical Christianity with culturally captive, co-opted, truncated, colonial, white supremacist misrepresentations and cheap imitations of biblical Christianity. I think that we can never say enough about that, right? So when folks say folks are Christians, you've got to ask yourself the question, what kind? Now, the reason that I need to continuously make this distinction is not only to show how people like Kirk fall on the other side of what Douglas called the Christianity of this land, but how many people, even in my community, will use this as a pretext for saying, see, we told you that Christianity is the white man's religion. Now, listen, I will say this, and I've got to say it. Many of us have gone through painstaking efforts. We have written numerous books. I've got some of them right up here. Urban Apologetics, Volume 1, Restoring Black Dignity with the Gospel. Volume 2 of Urban Apologetics, Cults and Cultural Ideologies. We have gone through painstaking efforts. Ministries like Jude 3 and even the documentary Unspoken. I mean, there's so many different works that are out there, but we have gone through, to say the least, painstaking efforts to dismantle and to disprove and to completely deconstruct and to refute false arguments that suggest that Christianity is the white man's religion, right? We've shown all of the evidence. We've talked about Africa as the cradle for Christianity, as a center of Christian thought, African Christian fathers, so forth and so on. We talked about it spread to West Africa long before the Portuguese and the French and the slave traders and all of them got there, and all of their missionary work and slave capturing and all that. We have decimated this argument. One of the things that really upsets me about this whole Charlie Kirk thing is that it just goes out of the way. If Charlie Kirk is a Christian, then it just goes out of the way to rebuild, to take all of those things that we have torn down and to try to reconstruct and rebuild the same argument, because it's very difficult to conclude that Charlie Kirk was a Christian and then not see the idea that Christianity is the white man's religion. But I would argue that it is the white man's religion. If we are understanding Douglas's dichotomy, it is the white man's religion in the sense that it is there. As he said, it is the grossest of all libels. It is a misnomer, if you will. If we're talking about that Christianity, I would agree. Yes, it is the white man's religion. But if we're talking about biblical Christianity, No, it is not. And the issue is in this conversation, what many blacks hear when they see black preachers going out of their way to not address what the real issues are, but to do what the one judge did when the white female officer killed the young African American of, I believe, Haitian descent in Texas. At her sentencing, you had one black officer that was combing her hair. Then the black judge, female judge, got off of the bench, came down, you know, the whole mammyism, you know, gave her a hug and gave her a Bible. Listen, we go out of our way trying to prove to white people that we've got acceptable levels of empathy when it comes down to their hurt, while never really holding them accountable to the lack of empathy that they have when we are hurt. And I'm not going to let it go. I'm not going to let it go because I want to know what these white evangelical pastors were saying in their pulpits, in their op-eds, in their written pieces, in their sermons, and all of that stuff. What were you saying when the young white boy walked into Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, while black Christians were having Bible study? And he killed every last one of them, 9 of them. And white officers took him, apprehended him without violence. He wasn't killed, although he was armed. They put him in their squad car, and they were so sensitive to his needs that they stopped by a fast food joint, Burger King, because he was hungry. You know, the killer was hungry. The white killer, he was hungry. And we were so outraged by that. I should say black people were, because white people weren't. Now, a few or so here or there, and I know some of them, right? They get it. They're on the right side of the argument, right? This is not to say all whites, just like I am not saying all whites are racist. I am saying that there is a significant majority of them who call themselves Christians who are. Now, you can't cancel Damon Richardson. That's a fact, right? So I'm going to tell you the truth. Most evangelical white Christians are, in fact, racist. And here's how I know. Well, they were conspicuously silent then. Here's another thing that causes me to know that what I am saying is true. When things happen to whites, like what happened to Charlie Kirk, notice when you start hearing all of the responses from white people. This is the worst day. He's a martyr. Now they're trying to compare him to King when he considered King a bad person. Now they want to put him in the same category as King. And, you know, one person says this is the worst political tragedy in our modern day. I notice when white people think in the context of America about tragedy, it represents for them an entire change in the world. Never before has this happened. Everything is different now. This changes everything. Oh, this was the shot heard around the world. They want civil war. That's what they want. So all of a sudden, when they are on the receiving end of tragedy, they suddenly frame the world as they essentially frame everything as reality based on their experiences. So in other words, these things were not reality before. As long as black people were experiencing it, it wasn't devastating. It wasn't horrible. It wasn't the worst day ever, right? This is what you would call black invisibility. It demonstrates that white people live in a ethos of white supremacy that is so indelible to the way that they think that they don't even see black hurt and don't even care about it. So when blacks are hurting, doesn't bother them, right? And no matter how loud we get about it, doesn't bother them. We're invisible as far as they are concerned, because if it doesn't necessarily affect them in any particular way, then they lack the concern. But when it does affect them, it's the worst day ever. The world is, I woke up the next day after Charlie was killed and the world was different. It's the day after tomorrow. Suddenly, everything is now framed according to the way that they think. That is what white supremacy thinking actually looks like, right? So I noticed that none of these people wrote articles, or none of these white pastors, white theologians, white Christians demonstrated that kind of outrage at the Emmanuel 9. Now, let me say something else. I saw some whites saying this. Oh, this represents Christian persecution. Christian persecution in America. This is Christian persecution. Well, let me explain that. First of all, let me educate y'all. Let me educate y'all. The first and only persecuted church in America was the black church. There hasn't been a persecuted church. The Christianity of this land that Garvey and Douglas spoke about, that kind of Christianity is married to the empire. They don't ever have to worry about persecution. But the black church, which wasn't married to the empire, which was an extension of historical biblical Christianity, that was historically the first persecuted church, whether we're talking about the invisible institution and even the visible institution in these here United States of America. That's a fact, Jack. Now, here's another thing. When Dylan Roof walked into Mother Emanuel and killed these black worshipers, not only was it a crime of racism, it was in fact a persecution against Christians. But notice, white evangelicals did not bill that as persecution against Christians. They didn't say anything like that. So what? Because again, they frame things around their myopic, Eurocentric, white standardization type ideologies. Charlie Kirk's death, that's Christian persecution. But black Christians they don't have any recollection at all of black Christians being killed in this country. Let me lay it out for you. And I want you to be mad, because that's what the truth does, right? Let me lay it out for all of you white evangelical Christians and pastors. Let me lay it out for you, because make no mistake about it, this is prophetic indictment and prophetic rage. So you are specifically getting it from me. And the reason you're getting it from me is because what we tend to hear when y'all do speak about the black church and black people, it's always on the negative. So the black people you disciple tend to come back to our communities holding up this white standard card and saying, we're not like this, we're not like that, we're not like that. They never have. Here's what I noticed. They never have an appropriate critique for white professing Christians and the predominantly white church, as in the evangelical church. They never have that. They only have false black crime statistics, mythological arguments about black fatherlessness, and black immorality on the rise, and all of these things. Everybody knows how to form arguments against black people and the black church, but I never hear, and this is whether those speakers are black or white. They never turn that around and say it to the white church. So guess what? Damon Richardson is going to do that for you today. Yes, I'm specifically saying, here's what I'm not saying. Not saying that all white people are racist. I am saying that white evangelicalism and the churches and the preachers that it produces is in fact racist. I am saying that. Now, so where was I? Where was I in this? I think I left off to make a point, and I'm trying to get back to it. So here's the point. Here's the point that I am trying to make. That this is the tale of two different Christianities, right? And when we look at biblical Christianity as it has been expressed, you can try and say, I'm looking through a black lens, and ethno-Gnosticism, and all of the dumb terms that you learned from people who are trying to, cape for white evangelicalism. But you're wrong. And I'm going to tell you why you are wrong. Black Christians have actually walked out biblical orthopraxy, orthodoxy, and orthopathy in terms of othering, having the right view and affections towards others who are not in our ethnic or cultural group. I'll say this, more faithfully than white professing Christians. Yes, we have. Absolutely. We have demonstrated for over 200 years what it looks like to be a persecuted believer in this country as a black person and still be faithful to Jesus. We have demonstrated what it looks like to love when we are hated. We have demonstrated what it looks like to forgive. We cannot be lectured. We cannot be lectured by the likes of white evangelical preachers or churches. We cannot. And the reason we cannot is because you do not have a moral leg to stand on. Now, let me prove what I am saying. Now, here is what white people who were professing to be Christian were doing. In the 60s, when civil rights meetings were being organized throughout this country, particularly in the South. Let's take places like Birmingham and Montgomery. White people who went to church every Sunday, who identified as Christian, preachers, ushers, deacons, you name it. Many of them were not only part of those who were spitting on blacks, sicking dogs on them, so forth and so on, but white police officers. And every time y'all call the police on us, or every time y'all throw up Blue Lives Matter, you're not doing anything differently than what you've historically done. You've always weaponized law enforcement against black life. So let me tell you what law enforcement was doing. In the name, in partnership with white evangelicals, who were many of them were Methodists, many of them were Reformed, many of them were Baptists. Here's what they were doing. They would go into the parking lot, write down the license plate numbers of all of the blacks who were in the fellowship hall or in the basement meeting and strategizing about the next protest, giving that information to law enforcement. And law enforcement, would then take that information and turn over the identities of those persons to the KKK, which historically in this country is quote unquote a Christian organization. Again, in Douglas's binary, the Christianity of this land, right? And so what did they do with that information? In order to stop the progress of getting black people registered to vote, getting black people to stand against the evil of racism. They thought to use that information. Faithful white Christians. Don't tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. You are here, sir and ma'am, to get an education, a real one that you won't get on Fox or Newsmax or whatever other foolishness you see in your algorithm on YouTube. They would use that information to terrorize black people because, as far as they were concerned, black people attempting to pull themselves up, black people attempting to do things that were in their best interest, right? In terms of being able to vote and finding representation and all of these different things, equality and economic equality and all of these different things. They didn't want that. The white people, namely white Christians, did not want that. So they worked against it. Please explain to me how that's Christian. Now, before you go talking about how long ago that was, right? That is just a generation away. My mother is 78 years old. We are from New York, so she did not experience the Jim Crow South, but she was certainly alive and watching the television when all that was going on. So folk like Charlie Kirk have parents and grandparents that are still alive. They are still alive. And they are the same racists today in church that they were yesterday in church, taking the same kind of anti-black positions on all of these things, such as how else do you get a Charlie Kirk who was 8 years old in 2001, having the audacity to say that it was better for black people in the 1950s and that the Civil Rights Act was bad, that it was a mistake. How else do you arrive at those kind of conclusions? Those kind of conclusions are not formed in small bubbles and pockets of white society. No, those kinds of ideas are the big block ideas that are alive and well and have been inside of white evangelical churches. They feel the very same way today that they felt yesterday. They felt, in fact, that King was a problem. It doesn't miss me that all of a sudden, white people have created an argument that Martin Luther King was immoral. Martin Luther King was hoodwinked us, that he lied about his real agenda. He was just a Marxist after all. All of a sudden, we've got this revival of anti-MLK sentiment. And even black folk are jumping in on it, attempting to quote things. They want to talk about whether or not he was orthodox and all these different things. And then even quote the FBI, Hoover's FBI of all entities, on whether or not Martin Luther King was immoral. And then they speak very matter-of-factly about these kinds of things. The fact of the matter is that there is absolutely zero evidence to the contrary of what y'all are saying, that Martin Luther King was ever immoral, that he ever committed adultery, that he ever did any of those things. The people inside of Martin Luther King's circle all adamantly deny that. In fact, I'm going to show you using deductive reasoning how I know that that's true. The FBI talked about King having some ongoing relationship with some unnamed woman, right? Said she was his constant paramour, something to that effect, right? And now here's the interesting thing. That's what they said. They never proved it. In fact, they went as far in the very same way that they did with all other significant black leaders of that time, trying to smear their names, their reputations by making things up. They sent an audio cassette recording of supposedly King engaged in sexual tryst and attempted to to use his voice as though it was moaning and sent it to Coretta. And even she was like that. I know one thing I know about Martin is that that's not him, right? That's not him. They did all these kinds of things, right? And here y'all are attempting to quote them as though they are as though they were ever credible as it related to Black leaders of that time. We already know how the counterintelligence program worked, and we know how Hoover actually acted. So the most trustworthy entity in that time was the FBI, right? So the fact of the matter is that Abernathy even wrote in his memoir that King supposedly did this and that on the night before he was assassinated. Everybody who was there said that Abernathy was drunk. He would have been too passed out, first of all, to even know, because they spent most of the night at the home of one of the other civil rights persons. I can't remember her name. She changed the name, but nevertheless, they all adamantly denied that, right? And so somewhere around 5 in the morning, they went back to the Lorraine Hotel. Abernathy was still essentially out of it. This was supposedly the time when King was doing a threesome, right? This is what Abernathy said. But let me show you how, with logical deductive reasoning, you can know that both are wrong. Interestingly, Abernathy said that about King, but conspicuously, he didn't say anything about this constant paramour. Now, if Abernathy was motivated to out King in the false way that he did, if there was any merit to what the FBI said about this constant paramour, that would have been the example that Abernathy had used, particularly if it was true. But what did Abernathy do? Abernathy used a made-up narrative just like everybody else. So let me just set the record straight, because what y'all going to do is get your mouth off of Dr. Martin Luther the King. You're going to get your mouth up off of him, because there is no evidence that he lived immoral. There's no evidence that he committed adultery. There's not one single shred. What there are, however, are claims. And none of those claims have ever been substantiated by any evidence. And you don't get to use the discredited FBI as evidence, right? And notice, they never had any hard evidence. They had claims as well. They never had video, and video was certainly around during that time. They never had it. But I notice how convenient agents are today to revive this anti-King sentiment and even use Black people. And there were Black preachers in that day and people who were on board with the anti-King sentiment, even in the 60s. So this is not new. This is just a revival of the same kind of thing. But who's leading the revival? I'm going to tell you, white professing Christians. And the reason that they need to portray King in this way is so that they can destroy the legacy of the civil rights movement. And further, let me get a swig here. Why do you think they want to destroy the civil rights movement? Because if you can destroy the civil rights movement, you logically move to, and this is where people like Charlie Kirk and many of your Republicans, your white Republicans, Black Republicans, and many of your white evangelicals, and even some of their Black evangelical sympathizers are. They have arrived at the place that racism never really did exist. That Black people have imagined this, that we've made it up, that in fact we are the problem, that the real problem is not white privilege or Black privilege. The real racists are Black people. And I noticed that these are the conclusions that many white evangelicals and even their Black sympathizers, folk like Vody Bacham and these types, are actually coming to. Because that's the next logical conclusion to come to. Once you can say that the civil rights movement didn't really have any moral merit, that it never should have happened, right? That, I don't know if you ever saw the what was called the voting literacy test. I want to show you the voting literacy test, right? So they were asking people in places like Louisiana and even Alabama. Let me just read off. Let me just read off an example of that, right? So I want you to see it. All right. So this is the 1965 Alabama literacy test. So it was number one, which of the following is a right guaranteed by the Bill of Rights? Public education, employment, trial by jury, voting. You had multiple choice. Number two, the federal census of population is taken every 5 years, true or false? Three, if a person is indicted for a crime, name two rights which he has, and that's fill in the blank. Number four, a U.S. senator elected as the general election in November takes office in the following year on what date? That's a fill in the blank. Five, a president elected at the general election in November takes office the following year of what date? Fill in the blank. Number six, multiple choice. What definition applies to the word amendment? A, proposed change as in Constitution. B, make a peace between nationals at war. And C, a part of the government. Seven, a person appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court is appointed for a term of fill in the blank. 8, when the Constitution was approved. I can go on and on and on. There's about 12 of them. If you got any one of them right, then you were ineligible to vote. That's how evil white folk were. And to be clear, let me be clear, the white church sat in silence and passivity and in agreement with these things, right? So that Black people could have properties taken from them that they had no right to defend, their lives taken from them, and they had no real chance in the kangaroo court. They had no right to vote for representation while they were being taxed. Now, white folk fought a whole revolution against the British over taxation without representation. And yet, because of the way that white people learned to think about Black people as barbaric, as not fully human, they were able to justify theologies that supported barbaric treatment of Black people in the name of Jesus, with using scriptures out of context. Yeah, things like the slave Bible, and using slave preachers and everything to try and convince Black people that it was God had appointed us to slavery and had appointed them to supremacy and to dominion. It was their manifest destiny. It's what made America exceptional. And all of that theology is inextricably woven into the theology and the thinking of the white evangelical church. Listen to this. Take your best scholar and debate me on that, and it will not go good for them. I don't care who you get. You cannot disprove what I am saying. It is a fact, right? So we have some significant problems here when it comes down to white silence, lack of empathy, and the faithfulness of Black Christians and the Black church to live out not only orthodoxy, but orthopraxy and orthopathy more faithfully than the white evangelical church ever has. In fact, we would argue historically that the white church, we would confront the white evangelical church the way that Paul confronted Peter. We would say that while you have checked off the right boxes on the Trinity, because obviously that doesn't come from white evangelicalism. You've even checked off the right box about justification by faith. That doesn't come from white evangelicals either. You've checked off the right box about the bodily resurrection of Jesus and the eschatological hope of Jesus' second coming. That's all wonderful. That doesn't come from you either. You've checked off all the right boxes, but you don't have any box checked off as it relates to how you have walked the gospel out. You are every bit as guilty as Peter was. Here's the difference, though, between Peter and many of the early Jews in his day and white evangelicals. The gospel corrected their behavior. Now, here's how I know. Let me go back to Bible, because, black people do know how to exegete, right? So let's do some quick exegesis. Paul's letter to the Galatians would have been written before the Jerusalem Council, as recorded by Luke in Acts 15. It's not hard to make that deduction, because the findings, the conclusions of the council was ratified. They said we all came to consensus and the Holy Spirit. They wrote their ruling down about the Gentile question, made copies of it, and gave them to churches. So the issue that was going on in Galatia about Judaism, all Paul would have had to have done if the council occurred first was just read them the letter, except he wrote a letter, which further proves that the Judaism problem in Galatia was why they ended up meeting later in Jerusalem. Second of all, Paul told us a story about something that happened even earlier than the time of him writing the letter. If he's telling the story, certainly the story would have occurred before he put pen to parchment, right? So he talked about the church in Antioch and how ethnically diverse it was and how everybody was good with it, even Peter, until some Jews who had believed on Christ but was still stuck on stupid, wanting to centralize Jewish culture and make that the basis for Gentile acceptance in the church, they showed up in Antioch. Peter started moving funny, right? Paul was there. It was his home church. He confronted Peter about it. This was the historical backdrop for him saying, you haven't acted right according to the gospel. But I notice when the council takes place later, Jerusalem Council, Acts chapter 15, not only is Peter in line, not just theologically, but in terms of his praxis, that he backs Paul up, talks about his vision, the one from Acts 10, and why he had to change course. What am I saying? Yes, God can save a racist, but you can't justify being a Christian and a lifelong racist at the same time. Because one thing we know is that Peter and the gang did not maintain their prejudicial views of Gentiles. They abandoned them because the gospel corrected it, which is why they started acting differently towards them, that they could see them as part of the family of God, of which they were also included. So no, you don't get to argue that your favorite slave-holding preacher was a Christian. He was not, and he will not be in heaven. No, you don't get to argue that your favorite preacher, let me name one, John MacArthur, was a faithful Christian. He was not. No, he wasn't. You don't get to argue after supposedly being a Christian all these years that slavery really wasn't all that bad for Black people and that God has even ordained slavery. You don't get to argue for those things and then be a faithful Christian. So at what point in your Christian walk did the Holy Spirit in your sanctification ever bring conviction and correction to your racism? Or are we making an exception for white Christians to be lifelong racist and never walk in repentance and in biblical alignment with Scripture? What I am saying is the issue is you don't have the right gospel, because if your gospel doesn't include in its full scope and reach how it brings about transformation, as in Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan. He not only had the right view, of himself in proximity to the man that was injured and hurt. But he had the right heart towards the man, and as a result, he took the right actions, right? So we have historical evidence that that's not what white evangelicals do or believe. So there is no biblical sense in which you guys could really be biblical Christians. Cancel me if you want to, because I can't be canceled, right? Y'all don't support me anyway. I don't get white dollars like some of the Black Hebrew Israelites think Damon Richardson gets white dollars. I don't get white dollars. I don't get white dollars. That's why I can come on here and get in folks' face and tell the unadulterated truth, right? So, yeah, right, there's that. Now, let me say this, because I've been going on for a while. This is a rant, so hang in there with me. So, let me say this. Hold on. Okay. Let's talk about Christian nationalism for a minute. Let's talk about Christian nationalism, because I do think that that is important to talk about. What Christian nationalism essentially is, right? So Christian nationalism, let me find my statement on that. Here it is. Christian nationalism is essentially the marrying of political activism and political vision with Christianity. It's essentially an attempt to Christianize laws and government to fit their truncated interpretations of Scripture. It is the synchronization of Christian ideals with politically conservative talking points. Right now, this didn't just pop up all of a sudden. I mean, you can go all the way back to Manifest Destiny, about the spread of American ideals across the West. You can go all the way back to their understanding, their attempt to live out American exceptionalism. You can look at how that showed up in their theology, dominionism, in the ways in which they interpreted Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. You can look at how they understand the Missio Dei, the mission of God, the Great Commission, and how for them that means essentially advancing. So to be clear, that is what Charlie Kirk was doing. It wasn't that he was out preaching the gospel. Charlie Kirk was out in his own statements, essentially advancing conservative ideals that he had conflated with Christianity. So Charlie Kirk's Jesus is essentially an anachronistic, Americanized Jesus that they needed to preach in order to essentially get the rest of this country to look like, to be Christianized, right? That's different. See, gospel preaching is about spiritual transformation of the life that ultimately leads to sanctification in the way that a person lives out their life. It is not about pushing legislation through the empire in the name of the kingdom of God. Jesus said it very, very clear. My kingdom is not of this world. Now, the same folk, every time Black folks start standing up, whether it's the Black church or not, start standing up for issues related to justice, white evangelicals respond with, just preach the gospel. But when it suits them, they marry the gospel, their versions of it, with their nationalistic agendas, right? And nationalism also extends to identity. It's how they see themselves. Their identity is predicated on a lie that Christianity, that America, that the USA was a Christian nation. That is an absolute lie, right? I don't know anybody worth their grain of salt in history that actually believes that, right? Unless they're brainwashed by the cult. That's not true. In fact, most of the founding fathers were deists. They were not theists in any biblical sense. And deism is the belief in a God, but in their vision and view of that God, he is disassociated and detached from the world. I created it, but it's up to y'all to run it. And that also helps us to understand how they could justify believing in God, right? Claiming to believe in God, because a deistic, right, type God wouldn't be concerned with what folk did with the world. He just left it for us to do with it as we see fit, right? So no, they while they may have had some values that are consistent with scripture, that is a far cry from calling it a Christian nation. In fact, they were trying to run from the Church of England. They wanted to create a pluralistic society where people could believe and practice various other religions, including Christianity, without persecution, right? So, yeah, that's what you would call historical revisionism. That is how you romanticize history. You just paint it differently when it suits your narrative, but that's not the facts, right? So, no, this is not a Christian nation, but that is exactly what they want to paint it as. Now, I want to quote Dr. Jonathan Alvarez here in a written piece on social media on decolonizing Christianity. Listen to what he says. He says the colonization of Christianity coming into the United States. He says, you see, European, that is white Christianity, exported values and epistemological self-understandings from Europe and defined them as normative or authentic Christianity. Deeply embedded within their so-called Christian worldview was the ethic of white supremacy. He mentioned how colonial Christians also perverted the Bible and weaponized it against Black communities and communities they desired to conquer. He goes on to say that the so-called Christian founders of the United States, most of them who were deists, what I just said, believed that there were ontological differences between different races of people and privileged whiteness as concomitant with the epoch of creation, while Black, brown, and indigenous peoples were viewed as childlike or barbaric and thus inferior. He went on to argue, he says, colonial so-called Christianity hangs its proverbial hat on an ethos of power and control. So this is what they're really after. It ain't really about the Great Commission and making disciples for Jesus and the other. What it's really about is power and control. That's why they abandoned focus on the family and all that talk about family values and all that other stuff. You want to know why they so quickly abandoned that when they got on board with the Donald Trump and the MAGA cult? Is because he didn't embody any Christian value at all. And suddenly it was convenient to say, we're trying to vote for a president, not for a pastor. And then none of those things that they have been pushing matter. You want to know why? Because what they really stand for, their greatest of values, is power and control. And so Alvarez says this. He says, slavers controlled slaves through barbarism, fear, castration, maiming, family separation, and chattel slavery. Settlers controlled indigenous people through forced migration, removal from sacred lands, re-education in European values, and genocide. Males controlled females through subjugation, inequality, denial of access to vote, disallowance to own property, rape, and abuse. Each of these inhumanities were done in the name of Christ and with the justification of colonial readings of the Bible. The demonic underpinning of this behavior is that it was all done in the name of Christianity, which is why some descendants of these people groups refuse to accept the claims of Christ, because obviously in their estimation, they're not making the appropriate distinction that Garvey and Douglas did. Christ's colonial ambassadors behaved brutally and in very unlike Christ-like ways. So miss me with the fact that this dude was a martyr. Charlie Kirk represented that Christianity. Yes, not biblical Christianity, that Christianity. Let me go on. Daniel Yang stated in his article, Tracing the Conservative Evangelical Strain of American Nationalism, he said, much of what becomes an evangelical form of Christian nationalism arises out of post-World War II efforts. He talked about what we later saw in the 80s, the 70s and the 80s, a desire to see national revival and a spiritual awakening. Figures like Billy Graham, Bill Bright, Jerry Falwell, Ronald Reagan offered post-war narratives of revivalism, which Daniel Hummel argues is an evangelical renegotiation of the relationship between personal salvation and national renewal, facilitating evangelicalism's mass entry into partisan politics. He says whether it was Billy Graham's early allegiance to Richard Nixon or the moral majority and the religious rights orchestration of Ronald Reagan's election win during this period, evangelicals have become deeply intertwined and almost synonymous with conservative politics. This is probably the latest precursor. He's talking about this latest iteration of Christian nationalism, he says, exhibited by many of today's evangelicals. He said, although these four men are no longer living, what they accomplished and what they represent is still fresh in the mind of this generation. Many of today's evangelicals lived through what these men were able to orchestrate. Other than Ronald Reagan, men like Graham, Bright, Falwell built their institutions on the construct of mission, evangelism, and biblical authority, all while simultaneously under the guise of preserving and restoring America to its Christian roots. Billy Graham's 1947 message is a clear indicator of this dual service of saving souls and preserving the American nation. Titled, Wake Up America, Stir Thyself. God help us return before it is too late. Now you understand where Trump's themes like Make America Great Again come from, or Make America Greater, or how people how people like Charlie Kirk can envision that at an earlier time, it was better in society. Consequently, it was better when Black people couldn't vote, when Black people were still living under Jim Crow. He thinks that because more Black families were together at that point, that must mean that we were a little bit more moral and that it was better for us. He gets to decide that it was better for us. Never mind the testimonies and the lived experience of millions of Black people in this country. A white uneducated man by the name of Charlie Kirk, and he was uneducated, very much so uneducated, gets to suggest that it was better for us at this period, a period where whites were completely controlling political narratives. Black people didn't have the right to vote. They were having land stolen from them. We were being lynched. All of this stuff. In Kirk's mind, civil rights was the worst thing that could have happened to us. I don't care how you try and spin it. Especially you butt dancing Black people. I don't care how you try to spin that. That is what racism is. That is exactly what racism sounds like. Listen, Yang goes on to argue, he says, the forms of nationalism and exceptionalism that assume supremacy and dominance over other cultures are not born out of biblical Christianity. He says these forms will almost always be oppressive and combative in nature. Jesus provides a clear vision for his disciples regarding political engagement. Luke 22, 25 through 26, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. And so we can see again that what Charlie Kirk practices is revisionist history. And I noticed that that's what all cults love revisionist history. They're the ones who talk about, oh, the Council of Nicaea was when, white people got together and invented the Bible and invented Jesus, all this kind of stuff. Cults are known for that. Well, listen, cults are not just religious. Cults are also political. They're sociological. Turning Point and MAGA are, in my estimation, no different a cult than the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Why? Well, look at what they do with history. They revise it in order to be able to prop up false narratives that are almost exclusively aimed at portraying and casting Black people in the worst light. You don't have to see it. I know you don't see it because you're blind. You are under a delusion, a strong one, in fact. When people are under a delusion, the facts are right there and they won't admit it. Right? So when Black people follow personalities like Charlie Kirk, I noticed that what ends up happening is that they are weaponized by other whites against other African Americans to deprioritize our concerns and lived experiences in favor of their perspectives. Right? That's what you would call white standardization, white normalizing, right? It takes whatever white people think and it makes it orthodoxy. It makes it the right way. And so when Black people are discipled in these kinds of contexts, they fall into a theological sunken place. And they see it as their mission to come back to other Black people and try to get us to see things the way white people see it, right? White orthodoxy, white standardization, right? And so I noticed the way that these white Christians do it. They promote voices like Candace Owens and Vodi Bakum and Virgil Walker and a number of others, and they give them a mic and they even fund their ministries. Why? Is it because they really have something substantive to say, or is it because they are agreeing with the white evangelicals? If they weren't agreeing with the white evangelicals, they would not have white evangelical support. But because they are, they become useful instruments to essentially act as overseers on what they think is a Black monolithic plantation, where we can just listen, even he's Black and he said it, right? So we're supposed to acquiesce and just bow down because you blew past you blew past 30, 40 million Black people in the country to find the one or two Black voices that agree with you, and then you send them back as evangelists, apostles, right? Missionaries into our communities to say that we ought to listen to them because they're Black. You want to know one thing that I noticed about Charlie Kirk and again, even these kind of folks. Let me stay. Let me stay on track. I got so many things that I want to get out. Let me stay on track. So I noticed that these are the type of Blacks who get on board with this sunken place kind of ideology and thinking, and then they're the ones running around saying stupid stuff like, they find nobility in proper grammatical placement of the adjective Christian and the noun Black. So they'll be like, well, I'm Christian before I'm Black, and I'm kingdom before I'm Black. There's no other group that gets put in a position to do that with Christianity, except for Black people. They tell us that as soon as we speak up about Black issues, that we're centering Blackness. That you're looking through a Black lens now. You're trying to make everything Black. Now, as long as we're silent or agreeing, it's all fine. Right? Listen, these are the worst kind of hypocrites. These are the worst kind of hypocrites. Yes, you are not welcome at the cookout. Let me go on. So Meanwhile, these types like Charlie and the black people who are discipled in these sunken place spaces, I notice that they never have critique for whites. Even these so-called content creators on YouTube, the only thing that comes out of their mouth is a negative critique about a black preacher or the black church or black culture. Never. Even if I were to agree with some of the conclusions that they have come to, because the black church has not been without critiquing itself, our own culture. We have had, and we do have many things to say about crime in our community, right? There's somebody who was like, well, you know, Charlie was brave because he would say what the black church wasn't say. Says who? Who says that we don't have a critique about what goes on in our communities? Who says we don't have anything to say about fatherlessness in the homes? And let me add, while I'm there, that the CDC's report shows that black fathers are more involved with their children than any other group, including whites. And you want to know what the problem with the myth of black fatherlessness was? Is that it was only using one metric, and that was fatherlessness was being defined as fathers only living in the homes. Well, let me say this. There's a whole lot of white fathers in the home that don't spend any time with their children, that don't have meaningful conversation with them. Fatherlessness cannot be reduced to being inside the home. That is a very weak metric, because there are a lot of people who are present and yet absent at the same time. But when we fairly look at the data in terms of involvement, it paints an entirely different story. White people now are more absent, less involved with their children than black fathers are, right? So I noticed that black people who get discipled in these kind of spaces, they love using these kinds of false statistics and all these kinds of critiques that point out stuff about black life. They never have that kind of critique against white people. And that goes for Philip Anthony Mitchell the same way. He will specifically point out, now I'm talking to the black people, and I'm talking to the black people, and he'll say specific things about how black people do and what black people think. Never once have I ever heard him specifically say, now let me say something to white folk about their hypocrisy. Let me say something to white people about racism. No. It's always about blacks. You want to know why? Because they have been discipled and thoroughly educated in white evangelical, white supremacist spaces. Yeah. That's where it comes from. Right? It's never anything positive about blacks, always negative. And on the contrary, it's never anything negative about whites, only positive. They get put up as the standard. Now, I talk to black Christians all the time who spent years in predominantly white churches. And I'm going to write a book on this. It is forthcoming, about Black Christian church displacement. Black Christian church displacement. What do I mean by that? There is a phenomenon that occurs when black people, many black people are discipled in predominantly white spaces, especially when they become disoriented by the lack of empathy, the lack of justice, concern for justice, and all these other things, and just the centering of everything whiteness. Culture, right? So white people get the privilege of defining things not as cultural, but as normative. They don't even define how they're doing things as cultural. What they do is just as cultural, as anybody else. Everything else is defined as cultural, right? So that allows them to be able to create these kinds of constructs like, oh yeah, we'll have cultural day, right? And while on all other days, everything is expressed through white normative culture, the way we sing, the way we preach, the way we learn how to preach, the way we learn how to do theology, all of that is just normal. It's just orthodox ways of doing things. And when black people start waking up about that. The problem, though, is that they never find their way back to predominantly Black church spaces, because when they were there, they were spiritually and theologically injured by essentially being discipled into this white standardization. And so because they have become so accustomed to comparing the ways in which Black people sing, the way we preach, the way we evangelize, the way we do anything, to the way that whites do it, and then finding Black people as essentially not aligning with that, because they have been so used to seeing the Black churches not really being a faithful carrier of the gospel and of orthodoxy in light of white standardization. Even when they see white churches act hypocritically, they would rather leave those churches and go nowhere than to find themselves at a predominantly Black church. That is called Black Christian church displacement. And you want to know who causes that? White, racist, evangelical Christians. That's where that comes from. I know y'all not liking me, but I'm a truth teller. That's the difference between me and the ones that you put the money behind, right? I'm a truth teller, money or no money. So let's get to some of these things. All right, let me say this, because I need to talk before I get into Kirk's videos. I know you guys have been watching. Stay in there with me. I want to talk about Kirk's strategy, right? I know people think, oh, he was on the mission of God and this, that, and the other. No, he wasn't. And I know that Turning Point's so-called mission statement was about teaching youth and college students about investments and this, that. That's what they said. But their real mission wasn't about spreading the gospel. It was about spreading the gospel of Christian nationalism and conservatism. And let me say this. He wasn't courageous. He wasn't courageous. Charlie Kirk was a coward. He was a coward. There's a reason why you never saw Charlie Kirk actually doing formal debates with Scott. There's one debate that I know of that he did with Dr. Rashard Ritchie, and you don't ever see that anywhere. That's one that he doesn't promote. But Dr. Rashard Ritchie, an African-American theologian and scholar, whipped Charlie real good. But you don't ever see Charlie really getting in the ring with experts, white or Black, on any of the things that he attempted to wax so eloquent about. And there was a reason that he didn't. Because just like any cult and any fundamentalist or extreme kind of group, their playbook is always to get the youngest, most impressionable minds. Charlie Kirk, when they say, oh, you got to watch his debates. You can't call those debates. These kids in their first and second year of college have very underdeveloped ideologies. That's why they're trying to find themselves. And there'll be one thing, one group 1 minute, another group another minute, this, that, and the other. Very underdeveloped ideologies, very underdeveloped worldviews, very underdeveloped ways of articulating and expressing what it is that they believe and articulating arguments. Charlie Kirk sits around every single day getting paid. In 2016, I think he probably had I think his income was somewhere around $40,000, somewhere $50,000. By 2021, 400 something thousand. Up to the time that he died, over 12 million. Because white corporations, white people who believe in that ideology, white Christians bankrolled him to do what? To spout off all of the talking points, right? And listen, you can practice these talking points until you sound good at them, especially when you're only in conversation with people who really don't know how to intellectually engage. One person he wouldn't have debated would have been me. I promise you that. I would have wiped the floor like a dirty mop with Charlie Kirk because he wasn't intelligent. He had you fooled into thinking that he was intelligent. He practiced historical revisionism. He didn't understand the use of statistics. He quoted stats and percentages wrong. He was just wrong in almost everything that he attempted to point out. But he was good at the way that he presented it. He came across in this, good old poised, good old American way of presenting. He sounded like he was patient and understanding. And he was just trying to have, listen, ain't nothing noble about using well-oiled and rehearsed talking points and challenging college students with developing minds, developing ideologies and ill-preparedness, rather than actual scholars and experts in areas such as systemic and structural racism, reparations. Never talked with the experts about that. No, we talked to about that college students. And you can hear how they struggled to answer his questions, right? It was extemporaneous, right? They were ill-prepared. But he had been practicing these talking points and being fed these talking points. But he was a pseudo-intellectual. No different than many of the other folk on doing YouTube videos. He wasn't as smart as you think he was, right? And so that's what he was doing. And he was doing it. Here's what he was actually accomplishing. He was taking a lot of these talking points and he was using these talking points against marginalized communities in order to radicalize college students into thinking that there is something inherently and predispositionally wrong and even pathologically wrong with Black people. He was discipling another generation. And I don't care how your kid liked Charlie Kirk. I really don't care. That doesn't prove anything other than your kids were being brainwashed by a racist. He was recruiting young, impressionable minds and radicalizing them against marginalized communities with the same type of indoctrination playbook as other radical, extreme, and fundamentalist groups use. Now, so there's that about Charlie Kirk. And, I'm not even going to engage with the trolls in the comment section because that's exactly what they are. They're trolls. And to be clear, Charlie Kirk appealed to bottom barrel people who lack critical thinking skills. Yes. So when Black people say nothing about racism, I talked about this, our silence is always acceptable. But when we speak up and we offer pushback, somehow we're told that we're centering and making an idol of our Blackness. And so let's get into some of what Charlie Kirk has said, right? So give me a second. Let me pull up. I think this one is on DEI. Hang on just a second. Let me see if I can pull it up on the screen. Just a second. All right. All right, just a second. Okay. Yeah, I think this might be it. Okay. Oh, hold on. All right. So let's listen to this real quick. Okay.
He wants me to have this discussion with you because me and him had this discussion this weekend. What are your thoughts about reparations for Black people specifically and like Black Americans specifically? What is your
very much against?
Very much against. Can I ask why?
Well, first and foremost, I don't believe that we should ever pay monetary damages to people where nothing bad happened to them, just because they are related to a group of people where something bad happened to them.
Okay. So
because it separates the idea. Let me just finish, and then I'll throw it back to you. Absolutely. Our justice system, when properly understood, is about individuals receiving justice, not tribes or groups receiving justice. And also, why would you tax, for example, somebody like me? My ancestors fought on the Union side of the Civil War, so I got to go pay more money, even though my ancestors did the right thing. No offense if you guys fought for the Confederacy. That's not trying to, drum up any, it's all good. We're all Americans now. I'm not. Why should I have to then go pay for something that my ancestors
by the
There we go. Sorry about that. I'm not as savvy with this, so all right. Were you guys able to see that? Hopefully you guys were able to see that. Were you able to see that? Okay. All right. Now, so there is an example of Charlie Kirk using bad faith arguments, taking advantage of somebody who didn't know better, and using a very racist argument for why Black people should not be entitled to reparations. Now, let me educate the folk who want to argue against reparations. I want you to do your homework in how the United States government offered reparations to white slaveholders after outlawing slavery, starting in the North, in terms of the gradualist policies in Pennsylvania, and then slowly after the Civil War, and the emancipation in the South, they offered white slaveholders reparations for the loss of income that they were receiving from slaves. That's number one. Number two, we also offered reparations to people in Japan, Hiroshima. So there is a history of us offering reparations to other groups of people. When it comes down to African Americans, the question is no. I find it ironic, though. This is a real serious irony here. Hold on. I find it ironic that on the Turning Point website, they put up a quote of Charlie. This earlier today. It says, it's a picture of him speaking, and it says, if you take away what a person owns, you control what that person can do. I just find it just so ironic and interesting that he could make that statement and then without flinching, turn around and argue that Black people shouldn't be entitled to reparations because it didn't directly happen to us, as though the lands and the wealth and the resources that belong to our families, that it would not have belonged to us generations later were it not taken away from them, right? He said, if you take away what a person owns, you control what the person can do. Then to listen to this guy turn around and argue that there's no such thing as systemic racism, when in fact, that is literally what systemic and structural racism accomplishes. It literally takes away what Black people can own and can do, so that ultimately they can control it. That's what creates the disparities with the wealth gap, educational gap, and all these other things. These things were not created because Black people were intellectually inferior. They were intentionally created by policies that gave white people advantages and specifically disadvantaged Black people by even taking away things that we owned. So I don't care how you try to spin Charlie. Charlie is conveniently arguing against systemic racism because it's convenient. Because in order for him to agree with it, guess what? Charlie would have to look in the mirror. And this whole notion about, oh, you know, my family fought on the Union side of things, that don't change the argument. Slavery was as bad in the North as it was in the South. In fact, do your history. New York City had more slaves per capita than any other place in the country. And when they were fighting, they weren't fighting, to be honest. I mean, do your history. As who was it? Not Sticky Fingers. He said, do the knowledge, do the knowledge, do the knowledge. And what you will find is that the Union soldiers were not fighting to free black slaves. There were black people fighting on both sides of the Union and the Confederacy, which brings me to my other point. This whole notion of bringing up the black friend and all this other stuff. You know, listen, I don't care how many black people you can produce talking about Charlie Kirk wasn't a racist. And I know him personally and all this other stuff. Listen, having a black friend or having some sort of proximity to, that's like arguing that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't a serial killer because, you know, I was his friend, right? He didn't kill everybody, right? And maybe he did have friends that he didn't kill, but that doesn't deny the fact that he killed some people though, right? So you arguing that, well, I'm Jeffrey's friend, therefore he could not have been a serial killer is exactly how you sound when you're attempting to argue that Charlie Kirk could not have been a racist because look, you know, I'm one of the few blacks in his circle. You sound stupid, right? Let's go to the next video. Hold on. Jeez. All right, hold on just a second. All right, let me get rid of that one. Just a second. We're getting there. We're getting there. All right, let me get rid of that. All right, I got all these things I got to try and, okay. All right, hold on. Here we go. All right. Let me share this one.
I believe that there's systemic racism in the society. When an African-American defendant comes in front of a judge, they are less likely to be able to plead down their case from a felony to a misdemeanor.
Instead of saying, you know, they really get different sentencing. How about this? Stop committing crimes. Yeah. Like, oh, I feel so bad that, you know, this guy, I know he shot up a home and killed 2 people, but he really got a tougher sentence than the white guy. Like, yeah, you're not winning me over with that, actually. Here's the thing. 50+% of all murders are done by black men. They are 7% of the population, and they do more than half of all the killing in this country. I am not going to pander and use, oh, I feel your pain and white privilege and sentencing stuff. How about you stop murdering so many people? And I'm not saying that blacks are doing it because they're black. I'm saying they're doing it when you don't have a father around. You are more likely to enter that cycle of violence.
I believe.
Okay. Did you guys see that? All right. So that was his statement on systemic racism. Now, I want you to notice how Charlie Kirk used. Oh, there we go. All right. Can you guys hear me? All right. Good. So I want you to notice how Charlie Kirk used what is essentially a reductionist argument. Notice how he denies that systemic racism exists. and then he reduced it to what he considers to be Black criminality. And you'll notice that what Charlie does every time he spoke, it was Black people represent 7% of the country. Then it was 13%. Then it's always another number. And then they commit 50% of the murders. Then at another time, it's 55%. Then at another time, it's 58%. He just throws out these numbers very matter-of-factly. Well, listen, if Charlie Kirk is the smartest guy in the room, who's really fact-checking Charlie? Not his tribe. They don't have any interest. They want to believe that what he's saying is actually true. Let me help you understand what systemic racism is. First of all, it's not a myth. And people who think it's a myth are, just the type of ignorance and delusion that you have to degenerate to deny systemic racism is unfathomable. But for Charlie and many Republicans and many white evangelical Christian nationalists would have you believe that it doesn't exist. Systemic racism refers to the ways in which laws, policies, institutions, and cultural norms produce and reproduce racial inequality, often independent of individual prejudice, right? So when they think of racism, they tend to reduce it to individual acts of racism, what a person individually believes and how a person individually acts towards another. That is how they're able to then essentially neutralize white racism by restricting the definition of racism to essentially mere prejudice. And in that definition, Black people can be and often are more racist than even the whites, right? Meanwhile, they turn around and deny systemic racism. And it's convenient for them to do so because the racism that was inherent in white individuals are now woven into the systems and the structures of this country. So even so that it doesn't necessitate white drivers, right? It doesn't necessitate white drivers. Systemic racism operates at the societal level. It's embedded in disparities in housing, in education, in criminal justice, in healthcare, and even in economic opportunities. So to dismiss it as myth, like Charlie Kirk and many white evangelicals do, is to ignore both historical evidence and ongoing data that shows how racial inequalities are not accidental, but patterned and persistent practices. Let me just give you some help in understanding what that looks like. So here's just a couple of examples, right? I don't have the time to give you an exhaustive list, but just from a housing and wealth standpoint, you not only have even modern practices where, say for instance, Black people were given loans that were at mafia percentage rates, knowing that they would balloon and ultimately creating masses of essentially foreclosed properties, right? So there was racism in the way that many of those institutions gave African Americans high interest loans that were unbearable, that ballooned after 10 years, right? But you have what was called in through the 1930s and 1960s federal redlining. So this is a federal government sanctioned racist practice. This is what structural racism looks like. Redlining, however, did not end in the 60s. Redlining still exists in many of our cities, right? So it denied Black families mortgage access. It restricted them to segregated and undervalued neighborhoods. And it is one of the number one reasons that accounts for the massive racial wealth gap between Black and white people. In fact, white families have nearly 10 times the wealth in the median Black family. And that is not by accident. It's not because white people work harder or because they had a dad in the house. It is because of systemic policies like this that prevented Black people from being able to own homes and even restricting where they could own homes. And those kind of practices still even go on today. That kind of redlining also impacted the way that schools in African American communities received funding so that Black and African American kids could be strategically undereducated by not having access to materials, to textbooks, and all these things. So the white schools had funding for all of that, better resources, better learning environments, this, that, or the other. They ensured that Black schools that fell in those red line districts did not have access to that, which also then turned around and created educational disparities. I'm talking about what our government did, right? And these kinds of structural racisms still exist today. For instance, today there's in education what is called the school to prison pipeline. Studies have been done on this. I encourage you to get your face out of Fox News and actually do real research. Due to the same kind of residential segregation of redlining that I was talking about, Black and brown children are disproportionately attend underfunded schools, and in many of these schools, discipline policies suspend and expel Black and brown kids at triple the rate of their white peers. Studies have shown, I literally saw one where they put white female teachers in, this was a controlled experiment, and they asked them questions with all kinds of kids in the room, white, brown, Black, Asian, so forth and so on, creating a scenario where a kid was talking out of turn and being disruptive. Which kid do you think it was? Every last one of these white teachers pointed to the Black kid, right? So they disproportionately discipline, suspend, expel Black children, which feeds what is called the school to prison pipeline. This isn't simply about the actions of individual teachers, but it is a structural form of racism that actually feeds the building of prisons. They literally determine the funding and where prisons will go based on the data that they receive from this structural form of racism. Access to higher education. For much of our history, prestigious universities included, but not particular, explicitly excluded Black students, while separate but equal institutions received inferior funding. It's quite interesting that while I'm talking, just several days ago, Trump pushed a legislation that snatched over $400 million in funding from HBCUs that are strategically used for things like STEM, for mentoring, and for many of the things that actually create opportunities for African Americans to compete in the job market. That is structural racism. And that wasn't from 1965. That was from 2025, 2 days ago. Criminal justice and mass incarceration. The war on drugs created policies like the infamous 100-to-1 crack versus powder, cocaine sentencing disparities, which devastated Black communities. So they want to talk about where Black men were no longer in the homes. When Black fathers started disappearing from the homes, it was between 1960 and 1980 with the war on drugs, when they weren't punishing specifically drug pushers as much as they were punishing drug users. Compare that today with the epidemic of opioid drugs and the rate at which white people are using them and dying. Right here in Georgia, they've got a zip code triangle where it happens significantly. What did they do? Did they declare a war on drugs and start arresting white people and throwing them in prison? No. They created policies to get them help. But in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they created policies to lock up black drug users of heroin, and then later in the 80s of crack. While, let's just be real, while contributing to the distribution of heroin and crack in our communities. Yes, our own government. Oh no, the government wouldn't do that in the Black community. Says who? The same government that sanctioned the syphilis experiment at Tuskegee? Same people? Yeah, miss me with that. You need a real education. What's interesting is that Charlie Kirk had none, and then had the audacity to insult Black women with the most education. I mean, in his view, people going to college were being shammed. It looks like his followers were the ones being shammed because they were being led around by a uneducated fellow. Healthcare inequities, voting rights suppression. We talked about in the 60s, the Jim Crow literacy test, to modern day voter ID laws, gerrymandering. Oh, we're not just talking about the 60s. Right there in Texas, they're trying to redraw the districts, the district lines. Why? So that they can control their electoral constituency, right? If you can manipulate the boundaries, you can essentially favor one particular party or class of people. You can ensure who gets elected every single time. That's literally what your favorite party of Republicans are trying to do in Texas, right? So that's not just an old thing. That is another example of modern day systemic racism. That's how it works. So sorry that people like Charlie Kirk didn't understand that, just like he didn't really understand what DEI actually is. There's this one video. Let me see if I can pull it up. Hang on just a second. Let me see if this is the DEI one. Just a second. Okay, I think this is it. Here we go. Okay, this is him now trying to explain his statement on Black pilots.
Last year, you said something about DEI, unqualified Black pilots. You see a pilot on a Black pilot. Don't you think it was an irresponsible statement suggesting that maybe these pilots aren't qualified or unqualified?
No, but I'll tell you exactly what I said and why I said it.
Okay, go ahead.
I said, if I see a Black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. I said, United Airlines is saying that they want 40% of all their pilots to be people of color or women. We have learned that we have relaxed standards anytime that we try to reach racial quotas. Anytime we reach racial quotas, we relax the standards. Standards for air traffic control, professors, or college admissions. Therefore, when it comes to pilots or surgeons, if I see somebody who is Black, as I said on the show, I'm going to hope I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. That's what I said, which of course is legitimate, because they're begging the question, we're not hiring based on merit anymore. We're hiring based on race.
We've all been in the back of a plane when the turbulence hits, or when you're flying through a storm and you're like, I'm so glad I saw the guy with the right stuff and the square jaw get into the cockpit before we took off, and I feel better now.
So when you see a Black pilot, you wonder, boy, is that person there because they earned it or because they were placed there? That's what DEI does. It makes you ask questions you otherwise would not ask.
So the airline industry is going to take an unqualified person just based off diversity.
Underqualified, not underqualified.
Underqualified, whatever, uncertified, and put them in a cockpit and risk people's lives?
Those are two different things. Under and un are two different things. Of course, United Airlines will not take someone off the side of the street and put them into a pilot. But in order to reach a 40% goal, they might cut corners. They might accelerate the process in order to reach a goal. We know this through all sorts of DEI examinations and projects over the last 10 years.
All right. Now, let's talk about that. So the Kirk apologists, oh, they were using sound bites and clips. Okay, I'll let that one play. And that was him explaining his DEI statement. And now I don't know what you heard, but that doesn't make it better. In fact, his explanation made it worse. So let's talk about subtext, right? Remember, context is what was said. Subtext is what he didn't say, right? But what he's actually inferring. So one of the things that Charlie Kirk inferred is that white people are inherently qualified for these jobs. That's what he thinks. That is why he thinks that companies like United pushing to diversify who they hire is problematic. He thinks that that means that what they're going to do is hire underqualified people. And for Charlie, underqualified people are always non-whites, right? He assumes that they are non-white, but he also assumes that whites are automatically qualified. He doesn't, if he sees a white pilot, let me show you how I know it's racist. If Charlie sees a white pilot, he doesn't think that that pilot got hired from DEI. He assumes that that pilot earned the job, that they are qualified. And the reason he thinks they're qualified is because they are white. He assumes that when he sees a black pilot, that they must have gotten in by DEI, not because they're good, not because, and one thing, if you know black people, one thing for sure is that whenever we do get hired in a position, we're not just qualified, we're overqualified. We were taught that we had to be twice as good as the next person, particularly white people, in order for them to even consider us. So I can't imagine a substandard, underqualified pilot getting a job anywhere that's black. That doesn't even make sense. Let me help Charlie or Charlie's followers understand what DEI is. Charlie was too ignorant or perhaps intentionally duplicitous in trying to reduce DEI to a racist practice, right? So diversity, equity, and inclusion refers to organizational and social frameworks that intentionally cultivate representation. That's diversity. Fairness in access and opportunity. That's equity. And belonging and participation. That's inclusion. Across differences such as race, ethnicity, gender, ability, socioeconomic status, and worldview. In academic, corporate, and civic context. DEI initiatives are designed, or I should say were now, to address historical inequities, mitigate structural barriers, and foster environments where all individuals can contribute and thrive. Another underpinning to Charlie Kirk's logic is that he assumed that there was fair hiring practices all along. The fact of the matter is that things like affirmative action and DEI were added in order to combat the fact that there were not fair hiring practices, that in fact, white companies were preferring to put underqualified whites in positions rather than overqualified and highly qualified blacks. Let's not go back to the 60s. Let's just look at the current administration. RFK Jr., grossly underqualified. The FBI director, grossly underqualified. The president of the United States, grossly underqualified. Almost all of his administration, grossly underqualified. Right? And what DEI was attempting to do was just that. In fact, you want to know what's even funny? Look at Trump's administration and look at how white it is and how unqualified it is. And that is exactly what DEI was aiming to mitigate against. That there were policies that companies were protected They could discriminate against hiring black people and hide it behind hiring practices that were racist, that you couldn't put your finger on. And what DEI and affirmative action did was force companies to hire from diverse pools of qualified people and not automatically put white people in those positions. But you will let an ignorant dude like Charlie Kirk tell you that DEI was something other than that? Like, you know, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. I gotta go. I know I gotta go, but hang in there with me. Hold on. Let me put this on. All right, hold on. Let me play this. All right, y'all gotta stop.
Our piece that Kirk describes King as, quote, a bad guy. It's true. And Kirk self-described very, very radical view that the country made a mistake when it passed the Civil Rights Act. Also true. As we note in the piece, Kirk has previously described Kirk as a hero and a civil rights icon. It's true. I used to be wrong. What inspired Kirk to shift his view on MLK? Why does Kirk think that MLK is a bad guy? When Kirk says that MLK says, quote, one good thing he didn't believe, what does he mean by that? Why does Kirk believe passing the Civil Rights Act was a mistake? Now, again, apparently they don't listen to the show because we do that at least once a week, right? Once a week, we talk about why the Civil Rights Act was a mistake.
All right. So there is Kirk essentially reaffirming that he thinks that Martin Luther King was a bad guy. And by his own admission, says that he shifted his view from a much earlier time. Now, what could possibly have changed in Charlie Kirk's mind to make him conclude that not only was the Civil Rights Act bad and a mistake for the whole country, not just black people, but for the whole country, but that Martin Luther King was actually a bad person? So let me get this right. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a bad person. And white evangelical Christians have come to the conclusion that Charlie Kirk was a good Christian. Let me go further. Now, back when President Obama was running for his first term, running against John McCain, white evangelicals who had married, obviously, the Republican Party at that time, they're just bowing and scraping at the altar of republicanism. And I don't have any problem with people who vote for a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate. This is not about liberals, conservatives, Republicans, or Democrats. I'm just pointing something out. They tried to find everything that they could, right? And so they evoked what is often referred to as the Farrakhan test. And that goes back to when Jesse Jackson was running for president, and they needed to find some sort of way to discredit him. And so what they found was, well, you are friends with Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan is an anti-Semite. He's a racist. And that just cast a negative shadow on Jesse Jackson, which made Jesse Jackson have to essentially denounce his friendship with Louis Farrakhan in order to remain some legitimate candidate in the race, right? I'm taking y'all to school, hanging there with me. So what ends up happening then is white evangelical Republican type folk evoke the same type of Farrakhan rule on Obama. They said he belongs to Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, pastored by the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, right? So these racists went through an entire catalog of Reverend Wright's sermons, right? That's how committed they were to racism. They listened to hours on end. They obviously had a whole team of people doing it. No telling how many people they employed to do this. They went through tape after tape after tape after tape of Wright's sermons to find one sermon, where Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright was prophetically critiquing the racist practices and policies of this country. And he says, he essentially was arguing that we stand on this whole notion of God bless America, as though America is entitled to God's blessings, which essentially is what he was critiquing was American exceptionalism. And he says, but based on the way that America has acted. Now, I know some folks, well, America ain't the church, but that's why you don't get to call it a Christian nation, because once you want to call it a Christian nation, then we do need to hold it to Christian and biblical standards. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. So he was critiquing the America that considers itself Christian. And he argued that they have not been Christian, that they are not, that they have not merited any of God's blessings so much to be saying, God bless America. He said instead we should be saying, God damn America. In other words, what he was arguing is that what Christianity in America and what America has actually deserved is not God's blessings, but God's judgment. And what did they do? They said that the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright was a racist. So let me get this right. Charlie Kirk is a good Christian activist, but Jeremiah Wright was a racist. That's what they want us to believe. That's what they want us to believe. Wright is a racist, but Kirk, he's a Christian activist. Yeah. Hold on. I'm almost done. Y'all. Hang in there. Hold on. Here we go.
Some of you will be listening to this episode as it airs on Juneteenth. The heck is Juneteenth? It depends who you ask, okay? But let's talk about what it actually is. The issue is that the entire point of it, as per postmodernists do and deconstructionists, is to subvert July 4th. That has always been the agenda. That there is a Black Independence Day and a National Independence Day, the same way that they have a Black national anthem that plays before NFL games. That they have Black-only dormitories and Black-only math classes. It is a neo-segregationist federal holiday. Why do these people need so much celebration? Why do these people need so many rituals? And the answer is super simple. It's because they're not religious. Well, they're religious in their own way, but those of us that go to church, we're part of something. So if you completely secularize your society, like, I need to be involved in something. So you just start to create this pagan garbage.
Listen, every single person who calls themselves a Christian, white or Black, who says that Charlie Kirk was a Christian needs to repent. You need to repent. Like you like, I don't listen. I'm going to be, let me just say it. Calm yourself down. Calm yourself down. Calm yourself down. Let me be controlled. Let me say it like this. Don't call me brother. Don't bother to call me brother. If Charlie Kirk is your brother, then Damon Richardson is not. Don't call me brother. Do not attempt to say that we worship the same God, the same triune God. Do not say we believe in the same Jesus. We do not. Charlie Kirk, let me just explain what we just heard. He reduced Juneteenth to a pagan holiday. That's what we are. You listen, you sunk in place, get out, Black folk stomping for Charlie Kirk. Juneteenth is pagan. You know what a pagan is? A pagan is a person that doesn't worship the one true God. Monotheistically, a pagan is a person who believes in polytheism, and as a result, all kinds of heathenistic religious practices, sacrificing children and all kinds of stuff, right? That's what pagan is. He says, you know, the reason that they need that is because they're not religious. So you notice how he denigrates and offends and literally just tries to destroy the veracity and the sanctity of Black worship. And you want to know what framework, what standard he's using to, well, they're not really religious. No. Because it doesn't align to white orthodox, white standardization, then it's inferior to him. Do you not hear that? For all of you, show me proof. I suppose that proof is not proof enough. What else did he do? Oh yeah, the only reason that they need you. Notice how, so this is how you recognize white indifference and white lack of empathy rooted in white supremacy and racism, because it's always smug. It's always smug. You know, this. Yeah, the only reason they even need it is they're just trying to compete with July 4th. Oh my goodness. You know, that kind of stuff angers me so bad. That's not just reductionist. It's just asinine. Number one, let's get this straight for all you Charlie followers, right? Y'all are in a cult, for real. Let me tell you, y'all are in a cult. July 4th, 1776, which is celebrating the independence of the United States of America from British colonization. On that date, no Black person living in the confines of what became the United States of America were free. So that's not an independence or a freedom for us. What Juneteenth did is it took one of the dates, it's not even the only date to be historically factual, but it took one of the dates when freedom was declared to enslaved Black persons in Galveston, Texas, right? That represented a group of people who were not aware or were not allowed to be freed with the other Black people in other states who were freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. Later, their own celebration of their freedom took on a more national celebration and fervor and became symbolic of we're not all free until we're all free. And then to reduce that to paganism and a desire to try and racially compete with whites in July 4th, and to say that it's just attempting to create some other racist practice that segregates white people from it. That is racism spilling out of every pore in his body, not just his mouth, but his nose, his skin pores, his ears, his eyes, his toes. If you don't hear the racism in that, I feel sorry for you. Racism has done such a number on your brain that it has turned it to mush. Because don't think for a minute that racism only has an adverse impact negatively on Black people. It has an impact on the people who imbibe it and embody it. I can prove that white people who practice and live in the spaces of white supremacy and racism are not as intelligent as they claim to be. Racism, just like sin, has a noetic effect on the way that you reason, the way that you engage logically. It has an impact on the way that you think. And you can hear that Charlie Kirk was no thinker. Nobody thinking intelligently thinks like that. So yes, racists are idiots. Racists are idiots. Hold on. Hang in there. Hold on. I think this is it. Just a second here. I need to find this one. Okay, hopefully this is it. No. Give me just 1 second. Let me see. Okay. All right, hold on. Here we go. No. Okay. I'm going to just try this and then we're done.
Some of you will be listening to this episode as it airs on Juneteenth. The heck is Juneteenth?
No. Okay. All right. Let me just close that down. Just a second. Okay. I think I can pull it up now. Like I said, I'm really not good at this. And I don't have a person pulling the stats. Here we go. All right.
If we would have said that Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called the racist. But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. They're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know. You do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot to go be taken somewhat seriously.
Okay. So there was that statement, right? So again, while we spoke on that a little bit earlier, again, I want you to hear the assumptions. You had to go and steal some white person's slot. So the assumption is that jobs belong to white people. Black people essentially take white jobs. This helps you to understand what feeds Charlie Kirk's belief on white replacement theory, right? So these are ways they've come up with this idea of reverse racism. Black people are the true racists. We have been using privilege against them. We've been taking their jobs. We've been displacing them. We have produced white guilt and white fragility. We are the cause of that. Meanwhile, they're telling us that every time we talk about our lived experiences, not just through slavery, not just through Jim Crow, but even all the way up into our contemporary times, systemic racism and injustice, they're telling us that we have adapted a victimhood mentality, when the facts is that white racist evangelical Christians are the biggest folk pushing victim mentality. Charlie Kirk preached victim mentality. He preached that white people are in fact on the receiving end of it, created by black people. So you notice, because again, The folk gonna say, oh, he didn't say all black women. He just said, let's hear him again. Let's hear him again. Let's hear him again. Listen.
If we would have said that Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson
Joy Reid, Michelle Obama, Representative Sheila Jackson
Lee, and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called the racist. But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. They're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action.
So Michelle Obama had to steal a white person's job in order to be a professor. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee needed to, because he plays a video where she's talking about DEI and how it is helpful. But for Charlie, because he thinks DEI means stealing jobs from white people, because he doesn't have the accurate, because he doesn't have a good acumen and a good handle on what it actually means, he interprets that as saying, well, the only reason we got these jobs is because they hired us because we were black, not because we're qualified. That's not only an oversimplification and a reductionist argument. It's a straight up straw man. It is a bad faith argument by a person who probably knows better, but desires to make these arguments anyway, because he's really hoping to create disciples who see black people in this way as less qualified, right? It's just all bad. I don't know how. You've seen how long it has taken me to. I just don't know how else to put it out there. Last one. This is the last one. Here we go.
Black people are only 13% of the population, yet they commit 55% of the murders. Why?
Because Black people tend to be in lower economic statuses because of
Okay, no, this is fine. This is great.
Basically,
so you think that poverty equals crime?
I think that it's highly correlated, and there's a lot of studies.
This is where
on
we
that.
disagree. What an insult to the working poor of this country.
So why do you think Black people commit more crime?
Well, first
Charlie
of all,
Kirk?
so how? Let me ask you a question as my answer.
Go on.
What percentage of blacks have a father around when they're raised?
I'm not sure.
20%.
So
80% of blacks do not have a stable father around. It is the most predictable way to end up in prison, end up as a murderer or a criminal.
And
it's not a
racism
problem. It's not a white supremacy problem. It's a fact that black fathers impregnate women and they don't stay around with the women that they have impregnated.
Charlie Kirk, do you think that happens more in the Black community compared to others?
It's threefold. Number one, we subsidize single motherhood. Number two, it's culture. It's accepted in the Black community, and it shouldn't be.
Culture. Okay.
Don't take my word for it. Read Thomas Sowell's own book on how Black culture allows single motherhood to continue into a nanny state type practice. 75% of Black youth are raised without a father in the home. 75%. Is that a bigger problem or not a bigger problem than whiteness, white privilege, or white supremacy?
Okay, so I want to do some work here, and this is the last thing that I will deal with. So Charlie Kirk, in a number of his videos, has repeated these crime statistics as fact. One video, again, he said we represent only 7% of the population and over 50% of all the murders. Elsewhere, he said we represented 13% and 55% of the murders. Then in another video, he claimed that blacks committed over 58% of the murders at 13% of the population. And then in another video, he said over half of all prisoners, over 50% of all prisoners are black. Now, the interesting thing is that the statistics actually show. I could easily have put them up on the screen. In fact, I think I did have some screenshots of them. I'll read them off. What the statistics show is that the prison population for Black people is 38%, and that it is 57% white. That is the prison population. He then further concluded that Black people commit more crimes than whites, and yet there is nothing in the stats that actually show that. Now, here's the thing. One of the things that he argued against was he tried to say, well, poor whites don't commit as many crimes. So he spits these things out as facts. When he presents stats, they're falsely represented, and then he throws out his own stats, his own percentages, and makes his own claims, like poor whites don't commit as many crimes as poor blacks. When every qualified sociologist correlates economics to high crime, it is a factor of, it is more factor, I should say, of economics than it is ethnicity, right? What Charlie Kirk really wants people to believe, in spite of what he says, is that somehow African Americans are culturally disposed to criminality, that there is something toxic in our culture that perpetuates this kind of behavior. Now, needless to say, there are elements in everybody's culture that is undesirable. I certainly don't support the sexy reds and the glorrillas and the drill rap and all of the raunchiness and all of that kind of stuff. That is the worst of us. But it is also a very small percentage of what you will find in our culture. Most Black people do not affirm or even think that is wonderful, just like whites don't look at the worst of their culture and uplift it, right? So let's talk for a minute about some of these numbers. First of all, this population misrepresentation is rooted in racism. This whole notion that the 13% figure of African Americans in the United States is false. I'm gonna just say it's false. Here's how I know. First of all, it doesn't include Black immigrants from Africa, from the Caribbean, and from South America, who make up a growing segment of the U.S. Black population, making it actually closer to 20%. Now, in contrast, whites represent 59% of the population in this country. But let me show you how that is also a number that is racially driven. By contrast, the 59% of whites not only includes European descendants, but it includes many Latinos, many Middle Easterners, and many other groups who desire to identify or classify themselves as white, which makes the white category elastic. It is a category that constantly grows over time. So an Italian can be white, an Irish can be white, Jew can be white, a Latino that represents 19% of this the demographic the demographic, they're not counted on any census as a race, as I should say as a race, but an ethnic group, right? So they represent 19%, but more than I think it's closer to 60, or what is it? 60, over 50%. Let's put it that way. Over 50% of Latinos, of that 19%, identify themselves as white. So the U.S. Census can include people with origins in Europe, in the Middle East, or North Africa, which they call MENA, Middle Eastern and North Africa, under white, which constantly allows that number to grow. So when you look at crime stats per capita, even, that is per every 1,000 person, it looks like while whites constitute a greater majority of people in this country, they commit far less crimes per capita and by percentage than blacks, even though their actual numbers would be higher because their population is higher. But the fact of the matter is that who can be considered black remains tightly policed and narrowly defined, while the white category is an ever expanding and shifting category. Now, let's even this thing out. Let's even it out. If we were to, of that 19% of Latinos, that is 62 million people in this country, who consider themselves Latino, who mark white on all forms. If we were to subtract that, right, and we were to subtract from the MENA population, that is Middle Eastern and North African, who represent about 3 to 4 million people, Arab Americans and all kinds of other stuff, who classify themselves as white, including people from Pakistan and Turkey and many of these other places. Here's what that would mean. Not only does the Black population rise to about 20%, the white population in this country drops to 45%. That significantly changes all of the so-called stats. The other thing I want to point out is that the crime stats, particularly the ones that Charlie Kirk is quoting from, comes from the FBI Uniform Crime Reports, or the UCR. That report is an arrest report. It doesn't have anything to do with actual with people who were actually sentenced. It has to do with people who were arrested and in some cases even convicted. Here's why that is a problem, right? Because what it doesn't include is several things. One, it doesn't include exonerations. So for instance, on one report, Black people it had on all of these particular, let me see if I can pull it up. Hold on just a second. I can't find it. But on all of the particular types of crimes, whether it was murder, whether it was rape, or any other type of crime, it had a list of all of the exonerations. So Black people were exonerated from murder, 58%. That is, now, mind you, if the FBI report said that 38% of the murders, or Charlie kept saying 50, and then he kept saying 58 and all this other stuff. The reality is that if we were to take that number and then we were to factor in the 58% in which Black people are exonerated from those crimes of murder, then what we've got to end up factoring into these numbers, because he's not interpreting what these numbers mean. We've got to factor in false arrest. We've got to factor into false witnesses, misidentifications. We've got to factor into falsification of police reports, essentially trumping up false evidence in which Black people were arrested. We've got to factor in the disproportionate number that Black people are not only arrested, but even sentenced significantly disproportionately than white people are for those very same crimes. That significantly changes the number. So built into all those reports is the kind of systemic and structural racism that we spoke about that Charlie Kirk actually denies. So we can't look at raw numbers and then weaponizing them without acknowledging population basis and understanding these reports in context. But Charlie has an ignorant following. These are people who watch Fox, Newsmax. They get all their talking points from Trump and these kinds of folk, and they don't care about facts. They look at very toxic websites and social media memes and all that stuff, and that's where they get these talking points from. White crime is often underreported and categorized differently. When Black crime is reported, then it is reported as an urban phenomenon. White crime is spread across rural, suburban, and urban context, which completely changes the way that data is interpreted. And so the other thing is that not only is white crime underreported and categorized differently, but one of the things Charlie Kirk says is that a white person was 10 times more likely to be to be the victim of murder at the hands of a white person, even though the stats show that every group, white, black, Asian, Latino, doesn't matter, are more likely to experience crime and even murder from somebody in their own group. It is because of proximity. A white person is more likely to be killed by another white person, a black person by another black person, on and on and on. But this whole myth of black on black crime, as though crime doesn't happen the same way in every community. What about white on white crime? If there is a black on black crime category, there would have to be a white on white crime category, because white people steal from white people more than they do others. They kill other white people more than they kill others. Look at your school shootings. Look at your mass shootings, with the exception of when whites chose to come in black communities and kill us. Who are they killing? Predominantly white people, right? So Charlie Kirk wants us to think black people are culturally predisposed to criminalization and that white people should be afraid, which factors into their fear and their unjustifiable backlash. Hence, oh, they want civil war, we'll bring it. You know, and that type of thing. Here, there was a white fellow who killed Charlie Kirk. Oh, the irony, after having said that white people have greater reason to fear black people because they're 10 times more likely to be killed by a black person than a white person, he goes off and gets killed by a white person. No, I don't need to be sensitive in saying that, because just like his killing was done at the hands of a violent person, Charlie Kirk's ideology and his teaching was violent to black life. So crime is typically correlated by people who know better than Charlie to be more of a social, not a biological phenomenon. Poverty, segregation, lack of opportunity are better predictors of violent crime than race. Kirk's argument is dangerous. I end on this because he cherry picks decontextualized numbers and he reinforces racist stereotypes while ignoring the structural factors that drive crime. His framing implies innate racial criminality instead of examining the systemic inequities. But when you get to deny that those things don't exist, you end up sounding like Debo in Friday when the fella asked for his bike back and Debo was able to say, "What bike?" as though he didn't take it. And then when he did acknowledge that the bike exists, he said, "That's my bike, punk." When you don't acknowledge that racism, not only individual, but systemic and structural racism exists, you not only become complicit with it, but you help it to perpetuate, because you say like Debo to black people, "What racism?" all while practicing it. Yeah, all while practicing it, right? So there are folks who are like, "Well, why don't y'all leave the country and all that other stuff? Why don't you worry about ICE coming to take?" Here's the thing. Black people don't owe empathy to nobody, not even the Latino folk who overwhelmingly decided to vote for Trump because they somehow believed that immigrants were somebody other than themselves. And now the Supreme Court has given Trump the ability to racially profile anybody that looks Latino. You see, that's what it looks like when you sow evil, you reap it. And so now for us light-skinned black people with quote unquote good hair that look like we might be Dominican, the Supreme Court has allowed ICE the ability to profile you if you look a little bit Spanish. Yeah, no, it ain't no such thing as these facts are off. You guys' brains are off. You have been indoctrinated and brainwashed in the turning point white evangelical Republican cult rooted in white supremacy. And then you want to act like black people don't know how to think? That unless our thinking is actually lining up to that we are wrong? Listen, y'all need to repent. You need to repent. White supremacy and racism is sin. And believing it, practicing it, and perpetuating it is sinful. I am not going to do Q&A. We've already gone over 3 hours. I intended, I did cover white nationalism, well, essentially Christian nationalism. White nationalism is a subcontext to that, nationalism as a whole. But I intended to be long. I intended to turn over every single stone. I do not intend that, I do not think, I am under no illusion that I am going to convince his followers. Because one thing I know, and I did a whole program on this, that sociologists and psychologists have shown that facts are not enough to convince people. That when people are committed to tribalism, the human brain has evolved it has evolved in such a way that self-preservation as an instinct of humanity, it extends to the way that we deal with information, right? So what that means is that a person who sits inside of some sort of echo chamber or silo belongs to some sort of tribe, and they're stomping for what they believe. When they hear the truth, they think that, well, if I go against my group, I'm going to end up isolated. And the human brain knows that we survive better in groups than we do in isolation. And so one of the instincts is for cognitive dissonance then to kick in, and for them to move the goalposts, deny the facts, all to remain in good standing with the tribe. And so the fact of the matter is that when people are committed to falsehoods, facts don't change their mind. I'm not here to change your mind. I'm just here to prophetically rebuke you for the false doctrine and the heresy of the racism that you believe and practice, that you were taught. I'm here to rebuke you of that. Now, you can repent or not, but I promise you this. Here's the thing I know. What you think Christianity is and what I know Christianity is are not the same thing. So you may continue to call yourself a Christian. What we have learned today, though, is that your version of Christianity is exactly what Frederick Douglass called the Christianity of this land, which he understood was a fraud and a fake, versus the Christianity of Christ. So if you're a Christian, well, that's the Christianity you belong to. And you've proven it, not just by your teaching and your ideology, but by your actions, which are nothing like Jesus, right? So I've made a historical case for it. I made a biblical case for it. You can argue as you will. You can try to demonize me. Here's what's going to happen. When I turn off these lights and this camera, I am going to go to bed and sleep as good as I did last night. I will not be worried about what you have to say about me or funding or my brand or anything like that. Won't be worried about that, right? Because my commitment is to the Lord Jesus Christ, not to Pharaoh, not to the empire, right? I don't worry about those things. I'll let y'all worry about that. Trying to align, trying to make sure that what you believe and what you say, is sympathetic. Even that whole goofy thing about Charlie Kirk somebody said, well, he doesn't really believe in empathy. And then his followers came by, oh, you got to hear the whole quote. And then he goes by saying, well, I think empathy is a made up word. I prefer sympathy better. Even that's crazy, because even his explanation only proves what we were saying about his views of empathy. And it actually explains why white Christian nationalists, evangelical Christian nationalists do lack empathy, because like Charlie, they don't believe in it. Here's the difference. Sympathy is just to feel sorry for somebody else. And perhaps Charlie and other racist white evangelicals do feel sorry for Black people. They're sorry that we are not white. They're sorry that we don't control, that we don't have power control in the way that they do. They're sorry for us. Empathy, however, is not just feeling sorry for a person. It is the ability to identify with their pain, to understand their suffering, and to have compassion that moves a person to action towards that person. Well, it's no wonder he doesn't care for empathy, because empathy would be too biblical. It would be too Christian. It would be asking too much. It would be asking them to lay aside power, to lay aside white supremacy, and to actually take action towards people who have been disinherited, who have been oppressed, who have been disenfranchised, and to do things that represent justice and mercy and kindness, kind of like what the Bible teaches, right? Because empathy is what the Good Samaritan had. He didn't simply, as Charlie preferred, I like sympathy, because you just get to feel sorry for somebody and walk away. Empathy is like what Jesus had. He saw that the masses of people that he was teaching were like sheep without a shepherd, and that they were hungry, and that many of them had broken bodies. So what did he do? He fed them. He healed many who were sick of diseases and oppressed of the devil. And he loved on them. And he preached the gospel to them. That's what empathy does. But that's not what people like Charlie Kirk believe in. So no, we didn't get it wrong. You got it wrong. You are the one who's brainwashed. You are the one who can't think critically. You are the one who doesn't understand the issues as they are, because you have been conditioned and brainwashed into white supremacy contours and forms and norms of thinking. And you think that people like me are the problem instead of people like Charlie. And that tells you how warped and how retarded your own brain is, your own worldview, your own thinking, that I'm a bigger problem, right? I'm the problem. Let you tell it. Let Charlie tell it, right? Y'all not ready for this. Go find your best scholar. Go find your best white theologian. Tell them to meet me in a debate square on these things. And then you'll see exactly what it sounds like when you engage. And I'm not the only one. There are Black theologians and scholars and academics significantly more qualified than me. You go tell them to go debate those people. Don't go do the college tour. That's you're just recruiting. Go find you somebody. Go find a Michael Eric Dyson and try that. You never seen Kirk do that with him. You never seen him debate Cornel West. You did see what happened when Candace Owens tried. Didn't go good, right? That's why they avoid real Black thinkers. And they would prefer to preach to their echo chamber. Because if they are the teachers and the thought leaders, well, the people in the echo chamber know even less than them. You think they're going to disagree with less information? No. It's just going to be full of amens. And preach on, brother. Man, listen, y'all not ready for this. Every one of y'all who considers yourself a Christian, if you are white or black and you support Charlie Kirk, Christian nationalism, and all of this stuff, you need to repent. It's idolatry. I'm calling you out. You don't believe the gospel, and your version of Christianity is idolatrous. Now, take it, do with it as you will, but you have been called to repentance. All of your institutions have been called to repentance for discriminatory practices against not only black students, but hiring highly qualified black academics. You're racist. You're not Christian. You're racist. And that goes down to the so-called Christian institutions. You have not lived out the gospel. You have lived out the tenets of white supremacy because that is the religion you practice. Yes. Yes. And I'm done. I'm not going to take any questions. I thank you. 3 hours and 31 minutes on this epic rant, but I needed to say everything I said. I had other things that I wanted to say that I couldn't get to, but I got to it. It is idolatry. You are not Christians. Your heroes weren't Christians. It's just so crazy to me how white reform folk will evoke the name of Spurgeon when they want to talk about cigars and when they want to talk about reform theology. But if Spurgeon was alive today, you would accuse him of being woke, a term that you hijacked, repurposed, and then made it a negative. Spurgeon was saying the same thing that I'm saying. He said, don't even fellowship with me if you believe in slaveholding. He said, you're not even a Christian. And what did the white reform people in Spurgeon's day do when he visited the United States? The good old white Christian reform folk in Florida put a death threat on Spurgeon and told him if he didn't get back across those waters that he was going to end up being lynched like the black people he was trying to advocate for. You don't love no Spurgeon. Why? Because Spurgeon wasn't a slaveholder. He actually preached and lived out the tenets of the gospel. Unlike your denominational presidents and your seminary presidents and your favorite theologians and of years gone by, and even many today that write for periodicals, even some like Christianity Today and many of those. They make allowances for whitewashing and white truncated, white nationalistic, white supremacist forms of Christianity to thrive while suppressing black voices. And just because you give 1 or 2 black people an opportunity to write an article doesn't do away with centuries of whitewashing. Y'all not ready. Y'all not ready. But guess what? I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. God bless you. Thank you for joining in Jesus' name.
But I think that we need to be equipped to the point that we are at least what Peter said. He said, be ready to give an answer, not get ready.